Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, January 16th, 2018 work session of the Falls Church City Council. We are delighted you all are here with us this evening. As I'm sure you've heard, we're going to be meeting at the community center for the next year or so while the City Hall is renovated. But we're happy that you're all here and able to join us tonight. Our first item, I guess, is the auditor presentation. Is that right, Mr. Shields?
That is correct, Mayor Tarter, members of council. We're joined tonight by Kieran Bawa, our CFO, and Megan Argenbright, who's a director with our audit firm, Brown & Edwards, and they've completed the CAFR. And so tonight is the formal presentation of the 2017 audit and comprehensive annual financial report to the City Council. And so we'll turn it over to Ms. Bawa.
Good evening, Mayor Tarter and members of the council. We have for you the comprehensive annual financial report for fiscal year 2017 that ended on June 30th, 2017. It is a over 6 months long process. We started the preliminary evaluations with Brown Edwards in June of last year, and now we're bringing you the final results that after they have concluded their audit. And it's typically due 11:30, and we bring it to you in December. This year we had some scheduled family emergencies, and it had to be a little bit delayed, so we're bringing it in January instead. It is a very long and tedious, arduous process, I would like to say, and I would like to thank the staff on both sides at the city as well as at Brown Edwards to go through the numbers. There is a lot of detail, as you can see the books in front of you, a lot of exhibits and schedules, and it was overall a clean audit, and I will like to introduce Megan Argenbright and to go over the different pieces of the audit, and we are here to answer any questions after that. Thank you, Megan.
So as Karen said, I'm going to go over, there's 3 deliverables in front of you, and I'm going to go over very briefly each one. We could spend a long time talking about the CAFR, but I'm going to hit on the highlights. In addition to these 3 deliverables, we do have other items that we perform for the city. We do the sheriff testing, we do VRS testing. There's some other deliverables. These are the 3 key ones, and those are the ones we're going to focus on this evening. So we did issue an unmodified opinion. That is the opinion you want. It's a clean opinion. There's a second opinion in this CAFR towards the back. It's an in relation to opinion on internal controls for compliance. And I always just like to point out that that opinion needs to be taken into consideration with the full audit opinion in the CAFR. You'll notice, and you can flip through, I've noted page numbers in case you want to look through with me. The opinion starts on page 1, which is misleading because it's like page 20 really. But there's one item in the opinion to point out, and that's on the second page. It's again, page 2. It's a change in accounting principle, and I'm going to hit on this a good bit. This is because a new standard was implemented in FY17, and that was GASB 74. And essentially what the Governmental Accounting Standards Board has done is, as I'm sure a lot of you remember, 4 years ago, maybe 5, they issued the pension standards where you had to put this pension liability on your balance sheet. In your case, actually, it was pension assets because you're funding your plans. But GASB 74 and 75, which will be next year, are for OPEB, other post-employment benefits. So I'm going to start, overall, that you've got your opinion, then you've got the management's discussion and analysis, which starts on page 4. Management's discussion and analysis is actually written by the finance office. It's a really good place to look. It talks about it's an overall view of the financials in the CAFR, and it's kind of a summary document of sorts, but it also provides a lot of current year to prior year comparisons and analysis with percentages that aren't provided elsewhere in the CAFR. Then you have your basic financial statements. which are your balance sheets and your income statements. So going back in the notes, there's a big note, note 19. This note is new. This is the GASB 74 note. This is where this year we had to include this. I'm sorry, note 19. I'm not going to go into much detail on it, but note 19 starts on page 83. It's called OPEB Plan Fiduciary Information. So this is, do you have a question?
No, I'm just going to, first off, make sure people in the audience can hear. Can you all hear in the audience? Okay, good. I say maybe we could open a door as well. Just this is a public meeting. I want to make sure that everyone feels welcome to come on in. I'm sorry to interrupt. And some folks had asked where you were, so I'm glad you mentioned what page you said. Was it 84 or 81?
83 is the start of note 19.
Okay.
And this whole note is new. It's GASB 74, which requires information on your OPEB plan. So for this year, it's just disclosure information that was required. It provides a little bit more information than was required last year for your OPEB disclosures, key of which is on page 86, is this sensitivity analysis. The purpose of this is that it's a liability, but it's a big estimate, right? Actuaries are doing their best to take the information they have and come up with what does the city owe, and how much is this other post-employment benefit costing the city. Of course, with estimates, there's always going to be some sort of sensitivity to that, and the two biggest things are the healthcare cost trend rate. And this shows you what your liability or asset would be if you changed that rate up 1% or down 1%. So that's just interesting information to just show you how volatile these numbers are based on the inputs actuaries are using. Another item that might be of interest related to GASB 74 can be found on page 101. And this is the schedule that kind of, it essentially takes a lot of the information that's in a note disclosure and just puts it in an exhibit form. But overall, about halfway down the page, you can see that the net OPEB liability is $529,000. The city portion of that, because this includes city schools and the training academy, the city portion of that is $302,000. So for the city OPEB plan, that's about what you're looking at. That's going to be an additional liability next year, split between the funds. I want to add that when you implement 75 next year, it's not just this one other post-employment benefit. There are others that are administered by VRS. There's the LOTA, the Line of Duty Act, and there's a health insurance credit by the schools. So both of those, VRS will provide the information, and there will be liabilities for those items next year as well, when GASB 75 is applicable. On page 88, going back a little bit, that's the fund balance note. That's always of interest. It breaks it down by what, there's different levels, non-spendables, items that it's just what it says. These items can't be spent. They're in prepaids and inventories are the two items that the city has. There's also restricted fund balance, and this restricted means limitations are placed by external parties. So those funds can't be spent other than for the purposes that the external party has put upon them. The difference between committed and assigned is less clear, really. Committed is when the council has to approve that those funds be used for something else, whereas assigned is just an intent to use those funds. And then the fifth category is unassigned. So right next to that on page 89 is note 25. I'm pointing out this note because it's new. GASB issued another new standard that was applicable for FY17, and it was GASB 77 for the tax abatement programs. There are two programs that are listed here in this note that the city has. I did want to point out GASB 77, the whole purpose of that, which with the purpose of many GASB standards, is transparency, and GASB 77 did not feel it was necessary to include TRA in this note, right, which is essentially elderly tax relief. That's not here. These are other abatement programs where the other party has some sort of obligation to do something. And the last section in this whole CAFR that I wanted to point out was the compliance section, which is at the back. And on page 151, and this is really more of a nice job, we're required to do federal compliance testing as well as Virginia state compliance testing, and we did not have any findings related to either of those items. So that's always a very good thing. I like to point that out when that happens. If you're curious, the major federal award program we tested was special ed, which is a very common one across the board to test. So that was all I was going to touch on the CAFR. If you have other questions on that, I'm happy to answer them now. If not, we'll move on to the next deliverable.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay. Vice Mayor Connolly.
My one question, I just want to make sure this is going to be up on the city website. Is it there already, or it's there? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask one just quick question, just for my own edification? So I was noticing you guys used depreciable life of 50 years on the government buildings.
Mm-hmm.
What's the standard for that? Just curious.
I mean, the 50 years is not unreasonable.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm just familiar with the residential and commercial being 39. Is it because they're government buildings and we expect for them to just last longer?
That's where
That's what I was thinking, right? Is that what it is?
Right, and the policy, I think, off the top of my head, and I will check this, the policy has a gap, right? It's not just, a range, so buildings is 20 to 40 years,
Okay.
right? So anywhere in between there, or wait, no, you're right, buildings are 50 years.
I saw 50. There was another reference to 20 to 40.
Right, 20 to 40 is
I don't know if there's
the
any financial benefit to like accelerating
So
appreciation of
in
real estate
governments,
assets
especially for, so like a lot of buildings would be governmental. You only record your capital assets on your government-wide, which is not used by the city for budgeting purposes. So in that sense, depreciation doesn't really play
I
a role.
didn't think it did. I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
That was a good question, though.
I read it.
Thoughtful. Yeah, you read the CAFR. It was amazing.
Not all of it.
Right.
Going on.
So we move like to the next thing? Or?
I had just a general comment for colleagues and anyone else who may be paying attention to the CAFR. So if you actually go to the back pages, there's actually some really interesting data at the back that if you haven't seen before, it actually, everything from who our top employers are to the biggest taxpayers. I think even tracks the number of DWIs we've had in the past 10 years and how that's changed, how our population and demographics may have changed. So I encourage you to look at, I think it starts from page 142 and on. But of note, for example, is the number 3 actually employer in town is now Kaiser Permanente. They've actually added, it looks like, over 70 employees in the past year compared to last year. So they're actually number 3 behind the schools and city government. So just some really valuable information in the back just to get a sense of how our city's changed in the past 10 years. Some surprising statistics too. I think recycling and crime, for example, I thought were actually going the opposite direction that I expected. Crime has actually decreased in the past 10 years, and our recycling numbers actually look lower than they were 10 years ago. So I wonder if there are just some calculation differences. But anyway, I just thought I'd point that out, that if you do make it to the end of the CAFR, there's about 10 to 20 pages or so of really interesting data included at the back.
Mr. Duncan.
In that same vein, experience has taught me that the most exciting and uplifting reading that you will encounter as a member of council is early on in the CAFR in this year's Roman numeral pages 4, 5, 6, and 7, where the narrative of our economic progress is laid out in a way which really is unique. I mean, as somebody who's tried to boil down the narrative of our economic progress at campaign time a couple of times, this is the best single place that people should go to understand what has happened here. You know, I won't repeat it, but the City of Falls Church benefits from over $545 million in new development investment along its primary commercial corridors in recent years. That would be $500 million of new development, and that would be $3.8 million in net revenue, which is about 9 cents or so on the tax rate. And then, meat goes on those bones as the CAFR narrative rolls out. So, so much goes on here. We've been very fortunate in the last 5.5, 6, 7 years to, serve at a time when the economy has generally done very well. And I think sometimes we just take for granted, oh yeah, we're having a grand opening next week, and that restaurant's opening, and next month there's going to be this place, and Target's going to be coming online. This is pretty extraordinary stuff for a lot of places in America, and even for Falls Church itself. And I don't know, I sort of made a resolution to myself that maybe this year's CAFR should be broken out. The narrative should be broken out. I'm going to ask Mr. Benton if perhaps, the guest column at some point might try to hit the highlights of that, just so people are aware of what's going on that we don't often toot our horn about enough. And it's not just obviously us, but it is, everybody. It's staff, it's entrepreneurs coming forward with business expansion plans, major developers, small businesses. It really is an impressive community-wide effort to generate activity that people here will find appealing in terms of commercial availability of activities and such to do and eat and entertain, and also an effort to generate resources to provide top-quality education and social and human services at a level that we would, deem appropriate for a city of Falls Church's reputation for progressive values. So thank you for all the work that goes into this. Let's go back and, try to hit some of the highlights in the next few weeks ahead, just so people are aware of, what we've accomplished. And this refers to things that are right over the horizon, like the Target. This morning at the lunch at the Chamber, the Target's having a soft opening March 6th and grand opening March 11th. So that's just right around the corner. That is mentioned in here along with other things that are coming ahead. So thank you.
Okay, Mr. Z.
Thank you, Mayor. Since this is the first time we've seen this, even though this happens every year, I'm not so sure that I would do any better if you gave this to me 3 weeks ahead of time. In passing, you had mentioned that there were upcoming GASB requirements that we should pay attention to, and I'm looking at pages 9 and 10 of your comments booklet, and it talks about GASB 75 and 81, and perhaps this is more for our CFO than for you, but there are obviously some implications of things we're going to have to do. So in terms of compliance, are there changes to our accounting systems? Is there an increased cost we're going to have to incur? Are there policy changes we would need to consider for compliance going forward?
At the top of my head, nothing that is going to be beyond the existing contracts that we have with our current vendors. It is more reporting, more data, and our actuarials would probably have to do more valuation reports, and we will bring those to you as part of the comprehensive report that comes annually next year. And I think that's the report you're going to discuss next.
Yeah.
So you don't see us incurring extraordinary expenses to compliance. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the second item is this comments on internal control. We call it the management letter. That's just what we call it because it's shorter to say. So this is the internal control letter, and right off, there's 3 levels of comments in the letter that could be. There's a material weakness, which would be, something that we feel like there's a control lacking, that there could be a material misstatement. Significant deficiency is not quite there, but something could happen. And then a comment is strictly just something that we've noticed that we feel like we would like to communicate to you that something could be improved, some sort of recommendation made. This year, we have a new comment for segregation of duties for the city. This should not be a surprise to anyone because the Deputy Director of Finance was performing 2 roles for quite some time during the year. And that is why this comment is in there. A lot of times, you have these positions so that you can have what people like to call checks and balances. We call it segregation of duties. But whenever you have somebody filling 2 roles, there's always going to be something. Now, we did perform additional testing to look over some of those items, journal entries specifically, but because the risk was there, that's why it's communicated in this letter. Of course, now, with Kieran being on, that role has been filled of Director of Finance. This risk is no longer there related to this position. So that's why it's in here. It was because it was during the year. For the big part, I'm not going to go over, prior year comments because we've talked about those in the past, but you can look over those. There's a nice large chunk of this letter starting on page 10 called Accounting and Other Matters. And this is the area where we just take some time to communicate, here are the GASB standards coming out, what's happening, what do we need to be prepared for. As I mentioned, GASB 75, this is a big one. It's coming next year, and you'll have some liabilities on your books for it. The finance department is aware of it. Your actuaries are aware of it. So VRS is aware of it. Beyond that, there are a couple other GASBs in the next few years. At this moment, I don't think any of them will drastically impact the city in the next couple years. Leases is a big one. That's coming in 2020. I like to talk about things, 3 years in advance, but leases is just a change in accounting. It'll take a little bit of effort to implement, but I don't see any additional costs related to that one. It's just, it's a widespread standard that will affect pretty much everyone. The last deliverable is the required communication with those charged with governance. This is a fairly standard letter. Your financial statements include estimates, for example, and we note in here what the significant estimates are. I mentioned your pension and OPEB. Those are big estimates. Your capital asset lives are a big estimate. So there's a portion here that goes over what are your significant estimates. Something that the city should be very, very proud of is that on page 2, we have right in the middle there corrected and uncorrected misstatements. There were no audit adjustments that needed to be reported in this letter. And I'm going to say that one more time because it's huge. There were no audit adjustments that needed to be reported to you in this letter. I had a total of 2 clients this whole muni season for 6/30/17 that I could say that to a city council. So that's a very big deal. That means that your finance department is top-notch and doing a great job.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Right. Right. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. There were 2 uncorrected misstatements. Now, these are items that we did find these 2 errors, one of which was related to capitalized interest. And this one, we didn't make it because, for one, capitalized interest is going away in FY20. So GASB has already said, we're going to get rid of capitalized interest. So this is a calculation difference, and since capitalized interest is going away in 2 years, we did not feel that it was going to impact any user's decision-making to make that entry. The other one was related to school pension. For your measurement date is different than your cap for your end date, and so there was just a difference in a number for that calculation. But again, the idea behind not making these entries was because we did not feel there would be any impact on users of the financials. Attached to this letter is the letter from the City of Falls Church. It's on the city's letterhead. It's about 7 or 8 pages, and these are all the things that management is taking responsibility for. They're the city's financial statements. We do prepare the CAFR with significant help from the city, but this is a good thing to read especially for management to read before they sign it. But it's always interesting to see just how much information is the responsibility of management. So, you guys have any questions on those items?
Questions? Vice Mayor Connolly?
On page 6 of the
The comments one?
comments, yeah. You just mentioned some issues with the school's current and prior year significant deficiencies. Has that information been communicated to the schools?
Yeah. So mostly due to staffing, they have a difficulty separating items that would be considered, best practice. There's a cost benefit analysis, like paying for an additional employee versus, the risks and what mitigating controls you can put in place. But certainly this information was communicated in prior years. It was communicated this year, and it'll be communicated most likely again, when we start the next audit with a new school director of finance.
Thanks.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Mayor Tarter, just one question. I think this is probably for Ms. Bawa and for Wyatt. I had noticed on page 22nd of the notes to financial statements, has reminded me to ask this question again. There was, what's that?
Yeah, I just wanted to listen to you.
I can.
Copy of the audit?
Yeah, we had it.
I think we have a box of them. Okay. Oh, here you go. You can have this go.
There was a point in here related to the County of Arlington for the $585,000 for jail services as well as the $656,000 for judicial services. Because I know this question will probably come up during the budgeting process, but based on the City Hall renovation, do we have an expectation of how much of that is going to be reduced now that we can do better prisoner intake and some of the other requirements from a judicial perspective that we had to satisfy by doing this renovation? Is that something that's been answered in the past?
No, I think it's a good question. It's a great question.
I don't know that there will be a positive budget impact. What we're trying to accomplish with the courthouse project was to address security concerns, but the intake process and how we're charged by Arlington County for prisoners will remain the same.
Okay.
It's a per diem rate, and it's something we do watch very closely. I think maybe 5 years ago, the county tended to be fairly formulaic in how they billed us, and then they surprised us by all of a sudden taking a look at the actual days, and we had a huge change in our billing.
Okay.
And so we don't ever want that to repeat, so we look at them on a monthly basis very closely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that's based on usage, strictly.
So just generally speaking, no cost savings associated with that piece.
Okay, other questions? If not, thank you very much for coming out. We greatly appreciate your work.
Thank you.
And before we get on, while we're making the transition to the next item, I just wanted to mention, I think, as everyone in council knows, we had a very important and meaningful Martin Luther King Day celebration that really started early in the day with a day of service that Letty Hardy organized, which was some volunteer work at Homestretch, and then on to the march, and then on to the ceremony at the Falls Church. But I think everyone on City Council participated in some or all of the day's events. So staff did a great job as well with traffic and the other things they did. So a very, very nice day. Why don't we move on now to the next item, which is the West Falls Church Economic Development Project and land disposition process. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. If I could just, on the last item, just say one thing very quickly, and that is a thank you to our finance team, Ms. Bawa, and our Deputy Finance Director, Melissa Ryman. It is a very rigorous team. They work very hard on this, and it was nice to have that independent review and independent pat on the back for a very strong team. So we have, Mr. Goldstein, why don't you come forward as well? So, Council, we have two items that are related that are on the agenda now. First is a discussion of the process that we'll undertake to take the 10 acres of land at the campus to market. So we want to spend time to describe that process and then and get the council's input on it. And related to that, we have a proposal for the zoning for the property and the entitlement process that we also want to present and get feedback on. I'll just say at the outset that our entire team recognizes that taking 10 acres of publicly owned land to market is a very serious undertaking. This land has been in public purposes and public use now for approximately 70 years. And so all of us are highly motivated to work in a collaborative way with the City Council and with the community to make sure that we're meeting community goals in taking this step. And the processes that we'll lay out tonight, we think, are a vehicle for us to meet those public goals. So what we have Mr. Risher, Ted Risher with Alvarez and Marcel here, and we have our new project manager for the West Falls Church Economic Development Project here with us as well. Mr. Risher with Alvarez and Marcel has 25 years of commercial real estate experience on the private side and the public side, and he serves as an advisor to institutions, universities, state governments, local governments who are taking land to market to accomplish economic development goals and other public goals. Mr. Goldstein has been working for the Deputy Mayor of the District of Columbia for planning and economic development, also in the realm of taking publicly owned land to market in order to accomplish public goals. So it's great to have our team together working for you and for the community on this really important project. So a couple things we're going to go over. We do have a draft RFP, which is a request for conceptual proposals. In that draft, we want to get it out and have a good discussion on it. The goal is to issue it on March 1st, about a month and a half from today. Our goal is to have a very solid working draft by the end of this month, and you're seeing sort of the first sections of that working draft that have been distributed. We have a town hall meeting that is scheduled on Sunday, January 28th, to provide an update for the community on the process, the schedule for both the school construction project as well as for the West Falls Church Economic Development Project. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Risher. He has an overview of what it is we're trying to accomplish with the request for proposals process. And I'll just say in summary, what we envision is a two-step process. First, to go to market, to ask for conceptual proposals and to ask for qualifications. And he'll describe in more detail of what we expect to get out of that process. And then in June, we anticipate that we will shortlist the respondents to that first solicitation. No more than 4 shortlisted respondents is our thinking, and ask for detailed proposals. And that will be work that happens over the summer, and we expect to get those detailed proposals for our review in August. And the goal is to then select a top-ranked respondent that then that we will work to have an economic development partnership with by October, with the goal of executing the agreement in June of 2019. So it's an 18-month work plan. And so let me turn it over to Mr. Risher for an overview of that process, and we look forward to discussion and any questions that you have.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I apologize for my condition. If one of my colleagues, Jay or Jen, was here, they'd certainly be taking my place. But as it stood, I was the lucky man up. So I'll try and get through this without too much wheezing. First of all, it's great to be back here. It's great to see everybody back from the break. One of the main things we want to convey with our presentation tonight is that we are on the schedule that we laid out in the strategic roadmap. We're keeping that schedule. The city manager, as well as his team, and Alvarez and Marcel, thank you. worked diligently over the holidays, and we began the process of refining the RFCP in line with the PPEA. We also began defining and delineating some of the accompanying market documents, bidder lists, identifying outlets for advertising and things of that nature. So we're very much on target for a 1 March issuance of the RFCP. I'm on the first slide. Excuse me. This should come as no surprise to anybody. This is, some of the overarching goals, and this is the language that will sort of inform the language throughout the RACP and the RFDP. We're promoting economic development, and we're very interested in the thoughtful redevelopment in mixed-use redevelopment of the site. We want to take advantage of our adjacencies to public transit, to other institutions, and to adjacent retail. We want the maximum amount of value adjudicated in a way that is suitable to us. We want the private sector to bring a vision that will augment the initial work we've done on the valuation exercise. And quite frankly, we want enough teams to make sure that they know they're competing against other solid teams, and they sharpen their pencils and lower their return requirements. We also want to foster economic development on adjacent properties. We want to encourage the Federal Realties of the world to perhaps consider redevelopment, although on a P&L basis that might be impossible, but we can certainly encourage it and engage our existing commercial real estate partners in some visioning for how to grow that gateway further east. So as Wyatt said, we have a two-step RFP process. The one is really the first RFP, the RFCP as it might be referred to, but really the RFP is really to qualify teams based on their ability to capitalize the project, their experience in doing large, complex, mixed-use projects, their experience in doing transit-oriented development, their history and their track record of working with municipalities, as well as other factors. On the conceptual side, we certainly will take a look at concepts, but our focus with the RFP will be to make sure we select a pool of extraordinarily qualified candidates that we know are going to submit extraordinarily good proposals. Then the request for detailed proposals, as Wyatt said, is the second step. We'll take that to market. Also, during the RFP, we'll refine the RFDP, making sure that we're responding to feedback we get from the market as we go down this process. We'll also be able to respond to community concerns and other stakeholders' concerns as well. I'll get into that a little more later. So basically, I want to take us from today to March 1. And there's 3 primary categories: RFP development, RFP marketing, and the RFP schedule. What's the most important thing for a solicitation document? Clearly communicate the city's goals and desires to the market. We're laying out the city's goals and objectives, and we're making sure that we're compliant with the issuing authority. We want to present a clear picture of what the city wants in return for this action. In terms of RFP marketing, we're going to identify, we've already begun to identify potential direct marketing opportunities with real estate firms that you know by name that are active in the region and the area, and sometimes on a national basis. We're going to present at NAIOP on 1 February, correct? We're going to have a table, and we'll be exchanging information with market players. We'll consider other events where we're able to direct market to the development community as well. And through this process, we want to collect industry feedback. We want to make sure that the process and the structure we've laid out is going to encounter no resistance in the market. We want a 99-year ground lease. We believe this is a critical asset for the city, and we want to maintain ownership of it. Now, in our experience at A&M, 99-year ground leases, especially on an accelerated basis, are just as good as fee simple from a financing perspective. We want to make sure that that's driven into our prospective bidders. We also want to take stock of other unique features that the city wants, including the upfront payment due at execution of the lease. And we want to gauge other factors that the private market may or may not find thrilling, but we want to make sure we're communicating clearly. We'll take that feedback into finalizing the RFP. So the RFP schedule, obviously the successful bond referendum for the high school started the clock. As I said, we're on target for 1 March. We're maintaining the schedule laid out in the roadmap. And by actually committing and following the process we have laid out, we've actually gotten feedback from the private market that that's building confidence in the process. So it's just one of the other things that the city has done well in terms of sticking to the plan it's laid out. Interrupt me at any time with questions, or I can take them at the end. RFP development. The approach really is to identify the potential partners we think are going to provide the most value and be the best to work with in terms of achieving not only the city's economic goals, in terms of upfront value to defray the cost of the high school and also long-term tax revenue, but also that are good with working with cities. We've certainly, in our time in A&M, we deal with municipalities and private developers all the time. Some are good working with them, some aren't. We all come from public sector backgrounds, Lee and me, Jay and Jen. We come from municipal government, and we want to make sure we're dealing with somebody who knows how to deal with a city and knows the fiduciary responsibilities a city has and the other asymmetric goals that the city might have in terms of non-economic goals. We want to create trust in the process. As I said before, we're following what we've laid out to the market. That's step one. We actually want to minimize the time and investment for teams to respond to a clear-cut RFP. We want to make sure that we're not overburdening the development community with something that at this point is unnecessary, which is lots of programming, lots of architecture and planning and things like that. We're interested in hearing about concepts. It certainly will be interesting to see those different responses from developers. But the most important things for us are going to be, what is your experience doing projects like these? What are your references? What is your capitalization? What's your balance sheet look like? Do you have the money, if you had to do this all in equity? We can use things as benchmarks to make sure that the people we're going to shortlist are highly qualified to give us qualified proposals. We want to clearly state the city's goals and objectives. We also want to maintain some flexibility. We don't want to be so rigid that we go into this and potentially miss an opportunity for something really interesting or something that could be advantageous to the city. So we'll listen in this stage of the process. We'll listen to things that we may not have generated ourselves in the working group, and we'll take those into consideration and report out as necessary. Clearly defining the components upon which the bidders will be judged. Again, the aforementioned experience, the access to capital, the references, and ability to work with a municipal partner. All this gets folded into an extraordinarily clear-cut, rigorous process for shortlisting. We'll tell them exactly how they're going to get to shortlist. We'll tell them exactly how we're going to assign weight to these different metrics. And we'll tell them the path to get to the second round. We also want to maintain compliance with the PPPA. I think I added an extra P. PPEA. There you go. Next slide. In terms of marketing, so we've crafted the perfect RFP. Now we need to get it out to the development community. This will increase the project's visibility. We have a developer list that we've developed through our business with a lot of area and regional and national developers. Those are certainly names that we're going to reach out to and make sure they're aware of this opportunity. We're going to establish lists of electronic and paper outlets to make sure that we touch that as well. We're going to confirm when we're marketing, as I said before, we're going to confirm some of the specific aspects of the project, such as the use of the long-term ground lease and the upfront payment. We're also going to gauge the effectiveness of the entitlements process that the city's already started, which we feel is a great signifier to the development community that the city is serious about commercializing this property. We're already in the path to rezone the property. Whatever special exception process may be added on later, I think will be fine because the development community can see the direction that the city's moving in. And we'll also begin to sensitize the private development community to some of the non-economic goals, whether they be LEED certified buildings, use of SWAM businesses, additional affordable housing, anything like that that we as a group collectively identify as city goals. And our goal will be to, tell you how much those things cost, right? Next slide. So here's the RFP schedule. We're obviously here tonight giving you the update. As Wyatt mentioned, we have an RFP town hall on the 28th of January. We're going to be actively marketing the RFP to the development community by telephone and in person in the 2 weeks in the middle of February. We're going to take that feedback and we're going to finalize the RFP development. And we're going to take this for council approval on the 27th of February with an anticipated release date of 1 March. I stopped coughing. I'm very happy. So this is sort of a snapshot of where we are in the 18-month process and what we're focusing on today, which is essentially the start of January to the end of May, which is the entire RFP process prior to issuance of the RFDP. You can see the instances of council approval. Excuse me. And this sort of gives you a snapshot of where we are in the entire process. As Wyatt referred to earlier, our anticipated execution date for the ground lease is March of 2019. So the RFDP agreement schedule will shortlist respondents for inclusion in the RFDP in May. We'll issue the RFDP in June. We'll also, there will be a 60-day turn for both the RFP and the RFDP. We want to make sure that bidders have time to put the proper effort into this without harrying them and making them frustrated. We won't make anything due on a Monday. We'll make sure it's developer friendly. We want their best effort. We'll evaluate those RFDP responses, and select the top ranked respondent that we will then include in a recommendation to council for selection. Excuse me, November 18 to May 19, we'll actually be negotiating the final terms for the ground lease. It's expected that we'll execute a exclusive rights agreement or some other agreement akin to that at developer selection. In May 2019, we entered into the lease and the sale agreement, and the deal is executed. Now, it's our opinion that the upfront payment, while unusual, doesn't necessarily create that much distress for private developers. When you think about a project of this magnitude, a project of this size, 2 years of pre-development and planning and testing and everything we can do with the school still in operation, i.e. the summers and over the vacations and stuff, in addition to the final entitlements process and putting together the financing. It's not that far off from what we'd expect for a project of this magnitude to take. So I personally view the $10 million payment as a break to developers who don't have to provide the full value at lease execution.
Sorry, Tim, did you say 10?
10.
10 million.
Yeah, sorry. And that's a number that's been bandied about and, obviously subject to change, but that's what we've been using.
And we should point out that that's a notional number that we've used for debt service modeling. We're going to rely on market experts and negotiations to determine what that upfront payment actually is. The more the better, but we've used 10 for debt service modeling.
And really what we were trying to do is see the effect of, the effect of that prepayment on investor IRRs and yields and things of that nature.
Yes, can you just walk me through the mechanics of that, right? So let's assume that it is a ground lease. Let's
Right.
assume that it's 99 years, which is fairly common. So you ask for a $10 million up front. Does that effectively discount the number of years associated with the ground lease? Do you just build it into the overall economics starting in year one of the ground lease? How would you guys, and this is, by the way, it's not like a leading question. I'm
Right.
truly just interested in how you do that.
Really what we did is we focused on yield, i.e. cap rates, and we focused on internal rates of return based on the product class. And so what we did was the yield is not going to be affected by that 10 million, of course.
Okay.
But the IRR, we made sure to stay above product-specific levels of return to account for that upfront payment.
So you guys basically underwrote what you thought would be a typical property expected yields, said if somebody's got to pay 10 million up front, 99-year ground lease, how do we basically back into that same yield for
Right.
typical product?
On an NPV basis, one could assume there might be some denouement of value towards the end. I think that, I might be being overly optimistic with the way I put it, but I hope that it won't be a marked decrease in value. And I also think if we get through to the RFDP and have 4, qualified developers, 5, 6. I really do think that having gone through that process and seeing the commitment the city's laying out, that we will get over our value. That's our goal, obviously.
Let me ask just a follow-up question, because one of the concerns I have is the timing and the overall delivery of the land to the developer in terms of when they break ground. I mean, I think everyone expects for there to be, some downturn in the market at some point in the foreseeable future. And when you look at the schedule associated with this and the breaking ground demolition of the high school, it may not be an ideal time frame. My biggest concern is making sure that whether it's through ground lease or outright sale, and it looks like the direction is going towards ground lease, that there are some guarantees in terms of revenue coming into the city, right? So let's assume you turn it over, they demolish the existing high school, the $10 million, you start with the ground lease. If the market turns and someone says, hey, we just can't break ground,
Right.
Is the only financial obligation you guys are contemplating at this point is we've got the $10 million in hand and they're essentially just stuck with the ground lease for the next 98 years?
No, we'll have sunsets on construction and things like that to
Okay.
be able to actively take over the site. We do envision the 10 million or whatever it is payment being non-refundable. It's basically, we will execute the ground lease
I would
with the 10
expect
million.
that, yeah.
Huh? So we feel that that's completely understanding the unpredictability of the market.
Right.
We also understand that, what we don't want to have is a retrading situation.
Yep.
Of course, if something catastrophic happens in the market, we'll all have to be reasonable. But I'm confident that 10 million is secure, is serving as the city's security to enforce performance.
Okay. And then one last, I have more questions, but I'm sure there's other questions here. Do you guys think it would be wise, or, should we contemplate, I know you mentioned sunset provision and other guarantees, but certain amounts guaranteed over a certain period of time, right? Because you assume all things happen on schedule. You've got concrete coming out of the ground, assessments increase, tax rates applied to it, we get additional revenue. So let's say there is that hiccup. Are there other provisions that we can put in place and signal at the very beginning of this RFP that, we do expect, and again, within the realm of what's reasonable,
Right.
Certain amounts of money at certain milestones?
A hardening schedule.
Exactly, right? And hopefully somebody's got a level of institutional backing when they make it to short list.
Right.
What would you guys recommend to make sure that the city, we got the 10 million, we got a ground lease, you can't deliver, if you can't bring a stabilized property out of the ground the next 5 years, you owe us another 30 million. And if you can't make it, and again, I'm just using that number, I'm not saying that's what it is,
Yeah.
or in 10 years, you owe us another X amount. I mean, I know that I've seen and talked with developers where they're maybe not to that extent, but they've put those types of requirements in there. Is that something, do you feel, is acceptable for this site? Is that something we should consider? And if so, is it something that we should signal early on in the process that, we made a commitment to the city through the bond referendum
Right.
to borrow $120 million, up to $120 million to
Right.
build a high school. Part of it was that we were going to open this up for revenue. We want to make sure that we're not stuck empty-handed to some extent for a number of years.
I certainly could see a hardening schedule, basically making, we could put the 10 million in escrow, whatever it is. We could harden it at different milestones, 25% there, 25% here. Obviously, we've negotiated deals like that before. In terms of additional damages, that might not be market, but it's something we can certainly explore all the opportunities to enforce performance. Certainly, if the market goes south, then we're all going to have to come to the negotiating table, and we're going to have to decide on a program that makes sense for the site. And my assumption is that the city will deal in good faith with its partner, and we'll address that. Right now, we're not planning on it, but the hardening schedule is a good suggestion, and the city manager and S can discuss it.
Okay. That's it for now.
Ms. Hardy and then Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, first of all, I just want to say welcome to Mr. Goldstein. We're glad you're joining us. A couple of more general questions. I'm glad to hear that you think we are on track with the ambitious schedule we have. As we look at kind of the next 18 months, where do you think the biggest risk in the schedule is? Where are we the most aggressive? Where should we be concerned?
Pardon me. I think we've laid out a fairly aggressive schedule. We've got 5 months for lease negotiation. I mean, it's our plan to basically sensitize those documents to the development community ahead of time and get exceptions back and things like that, so we know exactly what developers are going to take issue with. Did I speak out of turn, Wyatt? Okay. I think that's necessary to negotiate this deal in 5 months. And certainly after the process we're going through, I think everybody's going to be on the same page. We've got 60 days each for the RFP and the RFDP responses, which I think is extraordinarily generous. And all the while, we're keeping our schedule, as you mentioned before. So where could we run into issues? Maybe 60 days on developer due diligence is too ambitious for this size site with the, potentially latent environmental conditions and compaction issues and stuff like that. But I feel very comfortable with this schedule, in all honesty.
Good to hear. Second question before I'll let someone else have the floor is, I noticed that we were using PPA. So there's some sensitivity, I would say, in this community about PPA, mainly because of our experience 18 months ago in terms of the amount of information we could share with the community. I guess the short story is that we had to redact a bunch of information and couldn't share with the community the responses we got to the PPA last time when we tried to jointly do the campus project before. Maybe a question for both the attorney and you, Mr. Risher, and what sort of information do we think we're going to have to keep confidential and won't be able to share with the community, just so we can start managing those expectations now?
I'll say primarily for me, and Wyatt is slowly converting me into a full transparency kind of guy. Certainly for me, the necessity to keep the financial aspects of the proposals confidential so that we can review and assess the economic benefits of each proposal is necessary. I would love for conceptual drawings not to get out and influence the community who won't be aware of the financial conditions of each proposal. So there's a few things, but as I said before, I'm a full convert to whatever the city manager and the city attorney want, we will disclose. That would be the only high-level issue for me, would be to make public the financial terms of each proposal. I don't think that would help the city in its deliberations.
So there's 2 points of that. In the RFP phase, like prior to June, the market's going to be very sensitive that we treat their proprietary information with respect, because there's another step in the competitive process. And so that will be, a lot of this, the financial information and some of the aspects of their plans, I think just by the nature of the process, will need to be kept confidential. In the RFDP phase, at that point, it's late in the procurement. We haven't nailed this down yet, but we do envision a process by where the finalists have a chance to speak to the public about what they're proposing and answer questions about it, so that the public can understand the proposals that we're looking at and have some insights into it. I do think, though, that it's, once we've selected the top-ranked respondent, then it becomes a very public process. Everything is disclosed, and the land use approval process becomes one that we're familiar with, a very public process with all the stakeholders having a chance to see the plans and weigh in on the plans. So in terms of schedule, I think going in a deliberate way and a prudent way to always make sure that we're looking out for the city's interests. But I think getting to that point, which is on our schedule in October, I think is helpful. We've been down the path of having a process where by law we need to keep it confidential. And that's just a very hard public decision-making process. So as soon as we can get to that, having picked the top proposer, and then it becomes very public, I think the better it will be for the process.
But you think even when we get to the finalists, the 3 or 4 finalists, we will be able to have a very open community discussion about what their proposals entail? Or not until we actually choose the final?
So I think we're going to need to talk about that a little bit more. The state law does lay out what they can not disclose. So we'll need to work through that a little bit. But what we have discussed in the past is in that RFDP, to go ahead and let all the proposers know, is that we will have a public part of the process where we'll ask them to speak to the public about what it is they're proposing. Now, they may choose to take that opportunity to disclose their proprietary information and make their case, and others may choose not to disclose very much, and that's okay. But we want to make that opportunity available so that the public can understand better what it is that we're looking at and having to evaluate through our process.
I mean, if PPA is what you're using, I understand we don't want to break the law around PPA, but I think it's just a balance, given, what you opened the conversation with, that, this land has been in public use for the past 70 years. I think there's going to be a lot of attention on what goes up there, especially given that it's adjacent to the school site. So I think the community is going to want a lot of discussion around the types of development that would be right next to the high school. And so we'll just need to carefully balance what the bidders are willing to disclose, what lawfully we have, to do, and just make sure that we have a very open dialogue. Because I think people would be hesitant to choose an option without having more input from and discussion with the community.
And one comment I would make, Carol might be able to elaborate on this, but I don't think the problem is from the PPEA. The problem is maintaining a competitive process that has integrity. If the proposals are able to steal each other's ideas, then you don't have a process that has integrity. And so that's the issue, and it's whatever procurement process you use, you need to address that issue.
Mr. Snyder?
Thank you very much. I think Councilmember Hardy laid out an absolutely critical issue, and I would just underscore, I'm not even sure if the PPEA alternative, the way it's described in Virginia law, gives our population the kind of transparency that they want. So I think we're going to have to seriously look at that, because that's why that was a major point, thank you, a major point of why we didn't accept prior proposals, because the public just didn't have enough information. Second point I want to make is there's an absolutely critical point here where we have the development agreement, and only at that point will we agree to go ahead and issue the bonds for the school. So all this discussion about how we make the performance of that development agreement absolutely tight in an unprecedented way, because the last thing we want to do is issue the bonds and not have development.
Right.
Another point I want to make is,
Excuse me.
we've got, as reported, development on the Metro, proposed development on the Metro site and the university site. What are we going to tell developers about that? You take our project, assume that it's a freestanding project right now. What are we going to tell them about this other development? And that's going to become a pretty critical issue.
Right, and it doesn't mean we can't make it more clear in the RFP, but we actually do mention the sort of acknowledgement of adjacent landowners and the ability to create a project that actively or proactively seeks to integrate with surrounding development. But you're right, sir, we need to make that crystal clear that we expect people to coordinate with, especially the land to the north.
Well, coordinate to our advantage.
Right.
Okay. Another point we've learned through hard experience is that there's a legislative risk. What we saw at least one time where the legislature unilaterally extended the compliance period for special exception projects. Even though the city had granted certain things on the basis of a certain timetable, the legislature just up and said, well, we're changing the rules unilaterally to benefit the developers as opposed to the city.
Right.
How can we draft around that sort of risk so that we think we have a deal, we think we have an enforceable development agreement, and suddenly the legislature does something to change the rules of play adverse to us?
I mean, I can say, and I might defer to the city attorney, we're trying to anticipate and weed out all sorts of risk, including political risk. Certainly the city is doing its part on the entitlement side. Can we predict interference by the state legislature? I don't know, and I'll leave it to Carol to see if she has a better answer than that.
Not really off the top of my head, except that I think that what we need to do is make sure that we have agreements, contractual agreements, that would have to be honored irrespective of whether there was a legislative waiver or something. Now, suppose it And I think we could probably do something in our development agreement that would find a way to enable us to enforce the obligations under that agreement, even if some law changed that would require them to do something under a legislative action.
Okay. And finally, just two more questions. We've talked about the number 4. How about if we get 6 projects that are really good? We're not limiting ourselves, are we, necessarily to 4?
Leave that to the city manager.
Here's the thinking, is that it's going to be expensive to respond to the second solicitation. And so to attract the best work and the best proposals from that short list, we want to have a process where they feel that they have this is an investment that they might get a return on it. And so the larger the number, the lower the odds. So it may affect the quality of the proposals we get in. That's the reason for the shortlisting. But it certainly is, I think it bears further discussion in terms of the pros and cons of that.
So I'd be interested in the experts in the field, including Ross, as to how you feel about that as we go forward. So
I was just looking at these guys.
Well, I mean, a strong proposal is a strong proposal, so I think we have to maintain our flexibility going forward. Sorry. A strong proposal is a strong proposal, so certainly we maintain our flexibility going forward. I don't think we're rigidly adhering to any set number, but, Wyatt has a good point. We want to make sure that the final respondents are properly incentivized. That being said, if we can't delineate between the 4th, 5th, and 6th proposals in any meaningful way, then certainly maybe it's time to revisit that.
okay, and then one final question. I certainly want to communicate that we can be denser, higher, more in terms of commercial than we've had before and we've seen previously, and hopefully we can communicate that in some way. Documents as well as the road show and everything else we do, because if the documents say one thing, but we really say, well, we can take what we've gotten so far, then that's going to send, in my view, the wrong message. I think it's bigger, higher, more dense than anything we've seen so far.
All right.
In terms of commercial. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Mr. Goldstein, do you have something you wanted to say?
No, I just agree with Mr. Risher.
Okay, well, again, welcome to you as well. Thank you for coming.
I'm listening right now. But
Sounds good. All right, are there other questions? Mr. Z, and then Mr. Lichtenhouse, and then Ms. Hardy, and then Ms.
Thank you, Mayor. Earlier, you had said that you would bake into the RFP the requirement for a 99-year lease, and that you would talk to the advantages of how it would work to the city and also for the developer. I mean, these things are not unknown. But it's not currently in this package in front of us, is it? These things have yet to be written along with a whole set of entitlements, I would assume. So welcome to the city, Mr. Goldstein. There's been a lot of talk about various kinds of tax structures that could be applied to this unique parcel, as well as perhaps in a larger sense all the parcels that could be in play. The president famously said that if you can't solve the immediate problem, you need to enlarge the problem. So we know what the larger problem is at this point. And I would think as development guys, the last thing we would want to do is create a situation where we're creating value for the other sites for them to take advantage of after we get it done. So we create a sense of place that's worth 30% more in terms of lease costs, rent, and the kinds of businesses that we could attract, and of course they're going to take advantage of that. So there has to be, I think, some kind of thinking on how we are able to work in concert. And not going to use the word collaborative because I think there are going to be natural tendencies to be obviously in competition a little bit, but to find out what the sweet spots are. And I don't know whether that's going to be part of this effort or not, besides saying, well, there's other people around us. And so are we going to use this vehicle to try to lead that effort? So I think that has to be talked about. I don't expect to have an answer tonight. Now, with respect to these other tax-related structures, whether it be a CDA or a
Talking about TIF?
TIF,
Okay.
or, I guess it could even be a business improvement district,
Sure.
there are a variety of things. I'm looking for an analysis that, first of all, assigns attributes to these very structures, and what the benefits and downsides are,
Yeah.
and to bring that before us. I think that would certainly help our discussion on the things to consider, and I think we would then use that information to start building the foundation to getting a presentable, defensible product that we can get out.
Right. And interestingly enough, our partners, Bowen Smart, are pretty familiar with TIF studies, increment studies that we've used. I used it on 2 projects in DC. So it's certainly something that we can do going forward to make sure you have some context for. I mean, it's always a trade-off, right? If you set up the TIF district, and obviously you're having all new tax revenue from the development site, you're getting increased tax revenue from the adjacent sites. What are you raising the money for? Are you using it to subsidize the horizontal development on the site and therefore increase the value to the city? Are you using it for other projects? It's a trade-off, right? It's a value trade-off. So what we'll try and do is come up with a simple methodology to show that trade-off and explain it better to you. But it's certainly something we've been discussing. At this point, we wanted to keep it more simple, but the setting up a TIF district and doing a bond issuance off the increment is certainly something we can entertain.
Mr. Did you
Thank
done,
you.
Mr.
Thank
Z?
you, Mayor.
No, thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mayor Turner.
Lichtenhouse?
So I did want to have a discussion about a special taxing district, and I'm familiar with the TIF and some of the other mechanisms. I'm less interested in issuing bonds, although I had a discussion with Mr. Shields about there may be some state requirements in terms of how we structure that taxing district. But just kind of conceptually where I am on that special taxing district, we have 2 metro stops that bear the name of Falls Church, none of which really high-density commercial developments sit on top of inside of our taxing district. So I think about it in terms of some of what I would say are the unexpected liabilities associated with Metro. So the city does benefit from Metro, and we obviously contribute to that, and the costs continue to climb as we've had discussions in this council that predates me, has been having those discussions. And I look at it as you're opening up 10 acres of high-density commercial development adjacent to Metro, and is really the only high-density commercial development in the city that benefits directly from Metro. In addition to that, I would imagine that that's going to probably elevate the visibility of Falls Church's contribution to Metro. And I think that it would be appropriate to have a special taxing district, both in name and in purpose, to help fund some of the additional transportation costs associated with Metro or WMATA. So not necessarily structuring as a TIF or issuing additional debt that this tax revenue would pay for, but in theory and conceptually, and I guess in practice, having a higher tax rate on that commercial site, just that specific commercial site. And if we wanted to signal to the developers that this is to help compensate, this is to help pay for transportation-related costs. So again, not necessarily bond-related, but certainly geared toward transportation. But I think it is absolutely critical. One, I'm a big proponent of that on this site because I think we need it. And I think that this site will benefit from Metro and other mass transit, probably more so than any other site in Falls Church. And I think that it's only appropriate that that commercial piece bear higher costs associated with that. And I've struggled to figure out how you bifurcate those tax rates.
Right.
So it just makes sense to have a lower tax rate on the rest of the city, in my mind, related to that, and higher tax rates on that site related to transportation. So all that being said, I think that we need to signal in this RFP, not that we have to put a specific number around it to say it's 10 cents, 15 cents on top of, but at least let them know that there is a consideration for a special taxing district, and then we go through this process of discussing some of the finer nuances that you could have that discussion about what that might be. Right. Another thought is, and I could let city attorney and city manager weigh in on this because of that discussion, if there is some requirement that this revenue be attached to servicing some type of debt, I would imagine we could use the debt obligation to build the high school to check the box, because we've issued $120 million or up to $120 million in debt. and if legally we're required to service debt through a special taxing district revenue, that would check the box. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and then I got just a couple more questions.
So, deciding on a specific tax structure for the project is simply a budgeting exercise, right? And, deciding where those monies are going to be, utilized is up to the city council and your staff. Speaking to Mr. Z's comment before, it's a value trade-off, right? First of all, we have to be absolutely clear what we intend to do in terms of taxes for this site in the RFDP section of this, because we want them underwriting in reality. We want them to know exactly what our intent is with the taxing district for this specific site. So I think we have to be upfront and clear about it. I think, as with all things, presumably, were we to bond off it, we'd get the NPV of the additional tax flows over the next 30, 40 years. It's really all about how the city chooses to, realize that additional value. So if the city council decides that it wants to essentially fund transportation-oriented improvements from this, then as long as we communicate it clearly to the market, I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah, I'm less concerned about the impact on yield and NPV, just because we're signaling that we want higher density commercial, and most of that is, probably going to be passed through to the tenants. And I work in the area of property tax for a living, and the underwriting, there's levers, right? You get the assessed value, and they have the tax rate, and in many cases, they move those levers to get the deal that they want, and it's really not that big of a deal. But in terms of an additional $500,000, a year in potential tax revenue, or whatever it happens to be, it's a significant amount, especially when you talk about a $500 million, potential assessed value.
You can attack it two ways, right? You can attack it from the top revenue line, or you can attack it from the expenses. So if your OpEx ratio, which is, on a general basis, it's not very, specific, but if you're figuring, 38% of effective gross income, if you're going to raise the taxes and it goes to 40%, then there's a ceiling at which the market can't take any more in terms of revenue. So at some point, you're going to start to depress value. Now, if that's a city goal, I have no dog in the fight if we want to do that. We just need to understand the trade-offs with instituting it.
Okay. Yeah, the last thing I would say on that, because I know Mr. Lee was over here taking notes related to the tax. I'd love to sit down with you guys and talk about, the difference in the real estate tax rates in the surrounding area and the overall economics of the type of development that we're talking about, because we have some tax rates over in Tyson's that, in some cases are 15, 20% higher than what we have in similar type developments, and, they seem to be doing just fine. So we can talk more about that. I don't want to bore the rest of the council with discussion on property tax, although it's exhilarating, in my opinion.
I look forward to that exhilarating
We talk for hours. Hours. We will talk for hours and go through studies.
You've got me interested.
So the last two things, there was a discussion previously on an industry day, and I think just hearing some of the concerns, Councilman Snyder and Councilman Hardy, about transparency, in some ways an industry day, even though you're not holding a developer to the specifics of what they're presenting, it may give the community and the taxpayers here a little bit more of a look behind the curtains in terms of what a potential developer would provide. Do we have time for that in the schedule? Is it in here somewhere where I don't see, or we've kind of nixed that?
It is.
Okay.
We didn't put it in the but if you look on page 5 of the actual draft.
By the way, this is
RFP
the
itself.
start of this. It's obviously not the entire document.
That's right. But so the scheduled day for the non-mandatory project information meeting, which is the industry day,
Oh, that's what that stands for?
yeah, that would be
Okay.
March 20th.
Got it. Perfect.
We might brand that meeting a little bit better, but that's what that's meant to
That's
be.
a long name. That's a long name to say industry day. And then the last, I would say, is a follow-on to some of the other concerns that have been voiced here. I think that we need to make it as part of the decision process to get to the short list, whether it's 4, 5, 6, 3. I think in terms of our vetting of those, and we need to make sure that we make this abundantly clear that we want someone who has a successful record of experience pulling off projects, herding cats in various jurisdictions, Fairfax County, also including WMATA. There's going to be significant involvement, obviously, with VDOT. So I want to make sure whoever we bring in has got that expertise, because, as you know, in some cases it's the development is important, but it's even more important that you get with the right developer and somebody that can pull that off. So I would make that explicitly clear in here that you want someone with that type of experience as we go through the vetting process, that they can show a record of successfully pulling that off.
That will specifically be one of the 3 or 4 primary, measurements that we will do in the RFP is to measure that.
Okay, thanks, guys, that's it.
Okay, so I tell you what, how about Ms. Hardy, Vice Mayor Connolly, and then back to you.
Are we going to talk about the RFP too, or is that a separate agenda item after this, or should we take comments now for that too?
We can take comments for that now.
Okay. So quick thing, I think Mr. Snyder mentioned this earlier, but wanting this to be taller, bigger, higher, denser. I noticed that when I read the draft RFP, we kind of call out significant and compelling was the language used in there. What was the thinking on that versus kind of prescribing a minimum percentage or a range? I'm glad we're kind of leaving it somewhat open and
That sounds
and
like
it's a balance.
Jen's language, not mine. Significant and compelling certainly is compelling language. I think at a minimum, in order to convey sort of minimum standards of responses, I think we need to probably set a floor. And then we emphasize that, we're looking for the most market-responsible project that will achieve, the highest mixture of uses, the highest density, the highest height. We want to make sure that, within market reason, that this project can succeed. So I think we set a floor, and then I think we emphasize that we're looking for, and this isn't necessarily so much a RFP issue as it is an RFDP, but we certainly communicate that in the RFP. I don't know that we measure that because anybody can say, yeah, sure, I'll build 2 million square feet. It's not really measurable. But yeah, we certainly need to convey that to the development community that there's a minimum expectation for density, and we want their best response.
I'm glad you went there because when I read significant and compelling, I think it's subjective. So I think to the extent that we can put that floor minimum percentage, I think that is more explicit and more helpful. I wanted to reiterate the comment I think a bunch of us have made already around stakeholders. I know that we talked about having a task team, I think, internally in the city of managing the relationships with our neighbors. And I think we've talked about how do we bring them into the fold in this and how do we get more explicit in the RFP. I'd like to even be a little more explicit in that. So I think it's not only cooperation, but I think there's an opportunity for coordination. So how can we actually make sure that this is a win-win for everybody in that sector? So instead of just thinking about this as a 10-acre opportunity, how can people be thinking about it as a 30-acre plus opportunity? So I don't know how we can talk about, clearly we can only control our 10 acres.
Right.
But if there's a way to talk about in the RFP to make sure that whatever developer might be interested thinks about the opportunity bigger than just us, I think it could be a great opportunity for that whole kind of western part of the city.
Yeah, sorry. As I said earlier, especially to the east with Federal Realty, 20,000 trips a day. I mean, great retail, parking lots. The problem is their incentive is pretty low for doing anything in terms of reinvesting in their property. But I definitely think that we speak of the project in terms of a broader planning effort to enliven that section of Route 7 and really truly create, an entry point for the city on the western side. Federal Realty is obviously going to be one of the people that we directly market to. There's certainly the possibility that we could get a compelling proposal from one of the adjacent landowners that may shift our thinking in terms of, what is possible with the ability to sort of coalesce these properties and develop in concert with each other. So it's definitely something we'll keep in mind. We're definitely going to, speak of the property in terms of not just a single project, but, sort of the beginning of the vision for that end of Route 7 and that sort of terminus for Falls Church. What was it? Compelling and stunning, something like that.
Significant and compelling.
Significant and compelling.
So instead of, I guess, not necessarily instead of, but in addition to kind of waiting for the private kind of sector to step in, is there an opportunity, I think, maybe it's more for Wyatt, on stakeholder engagement beyond what we've done already at the staff level to kind of bring in the universities, WMATA, Fairfax County, and actually just have a more explicit 4-way meeting that says, hey, here's an opportunity for the western part of Falls Church. What do you guys want out of this? And actually just have a discussion beyond. I think we've had plenty of staff level discussions, but I think there's an appetite to kind of do more than that. And I think the RFP, as well as what WMATA submitted to Fairfax County, I think indicates an interest from them as well.
Sure. Agree.
And there's really two potential adjacencies, right? You've got the UVA Virginia Tech Center to the north, but you've also got the school. We want to integrate this development in and work with the school stakeholders to make sure that we're doing something that's mutually beneficial and provides amenities to not only students but other residents. So I don't think there's any reason we wouldn't include the idea of actively coordinating with the adjacent landowners.
I know other priority in the next kind of 30 days or so is really marketing and getting the RFP out. I think the success of this project will also hinge on how well we engage our neighbors and how being good neighbors with everybody. So I'd like to see just as much attention and standing up kind of that task group around relationship management. And I think that's definitely more on city. I think city council is certainly willing to help engage in that and play a role in that too, because I think being good neighbors up front, I think, is only going to help us at the end.
Totally agree.
Okay, Vice Mayor Connolly, and I think Mr. Snyder, did you have a comment as well?
Well, just that the
get
stakeholders
'em.
meeting we had some time ago actually engaged many of those people, and I think is part of the reason WMATA is moving ahead with Fairfax to at least get a marker in there to do something with their property. We had many of those people together, and I think we will continue that work because we see the connectivity of this project and its influence on all the rest of the commercial property in the city, west of the WNOD Trail. So I think that's begun. Follow-ups along those same lines make sense, and that's part of the small area planning process as well.
Let me just add, I think that's a great objective, but I think we also have to plan to do it on our own, because unfortunately the history from our neighbors has not always been positive toward us. I think we ought to go with that notion. But I also don't want a situation where the revenue-generating development is on their side and the negative part is on our side. Thanks.
Vice Mayor Connolly?
I have three specific questions. One is on the schedule and the term. We've used the term roadshow before. Where does the roadshow part fit into the schedule here?
That would be in the 6th to,
Month of February.
the 5th to
That's
the
the-
16th of February.
So the roadshow happens before this is
Yeah.
released?
Yeah, and
It's designed primarily to market the project to, potential bidders, as well as to sort of solicit that feedback and make sure that we're not bumping up against any third rails.
Right, and that includes the NAIOP meeting you referenced.
Actually, the NAIOP meeting is 1 February, but yes, it's all part of the
Okay.
same effort.
And what else is part of that effort? Is it yet to be determined? Or has it been set?
I think Mr. Risher described it very well.
Okay. Meaning that it hasn't all officially been set yet, but is evolving?
Yeah, it's a chance to have the document go out to the market and get some feedback on it.
Okay, so it's not specifically people driving around presenting it, it's more of a,
It would certainly be more fun to be in like some old time truck,
Right, that's what
riding
I'm
around with a big
envisioning,
sign.
right.
But I don't think that will happen. I think there'll be. I'll leave it to the city manager, but
okay. So it's communication back and forth, but it's not an official location and set of.
Correct.
Russia. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. All right, my second question is about the small area plan that Jim referenced. We haven't yet done the small area plan for the west end of town up until we get to Director's Way. Do we have a schedule for that, and how does that fit in? Because that is the land that is ours, that we can. Oh, I was just off the whole time. So my question is related to the small area plan for the neighborhood up to the campus. What is the schedule for that, and how does that dovetail with
We're
all
looking
of
at
this?
that happening more in the spring and summer. As you know, the Planning Commission approved, and is becoming before you, the land use planning for this particular area on the school site, which is essential. This will be something that we'll be working on. As this evolves, and we would see adoption of a final small area plan, after we get through the development approval and the rezoning on this property, which would give, we'll learn from that, and we'll have a greater idea and be able to document that in the final small area plan. I would hope we could give general guidance on everything west of the WNOD Trail, because as we've talked about this and worked with people, the importance of that area and that connectivity of that trail comes forward time and time again by everyone we talk to. So I think giving general guidance, not perhaps as specific as we have in other plans, but general guidance about what the future of that area is, would be one of the objectives of the small area plan. Some of you may have seen the diagrammatic sketch which kind of showed those areas to the west of the W Trail and how they might all integrate together. So it'd be going beyond that and doing more detail beyond that, and having discussions with those property owners as well.
So timeline-wise, do we expect that to be done in the same time period that this is done?
I'm seeing it happen kind of after we finish this work, and we would memorialize a lot of this work.
Okay,
We're working on drafts. We've circulated draft concepts. We've gotten feedback on them. Typically, we finish those up, after major land use and zoning decisions have been made. For example, the West Broad Street project was one of those, where we finalized that after the Founders Row.
I guess I'm having trouble with the word after, because there's a date of 2019 and a date of 2021. So what are we? We're after the finalization of the RFDP, then we'll move into that?
Well, we're going to be working on it, but I don't see it being finally adopted by council until you're kind of done with that.
Okay.
Selecting your developer. and
Okay, that's the
getting to that
after you're
point.
talking
Yes,
about,
that's
not,
after.
okay.
You've
Thank you.
concluded that portion of it. We know what the intention of the council is for that site.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question has to do with the wording. In the RFCP, it's page 4.
Yep.
Oh, I'm off. Okay, page 4. The development section, I think it's 2B, where we're asking them to demolish the existing high school.
Right.
The RFCP that the schools put out, they're asking the developer to demolish the existing high school.
Yeah, we're aware of that, and I think it's an opportunity for further discussion with the schools. It's a good, it's one of these things that I think the coordinating council can do. Right now, we want it in there. We think actually it's most efficient for the private sector to do it. The schools have a concern that it might not happen exactly when they want it, and they're afraid of having an empty building that's an attractive nuisance. And so we're going to work that out. But right now, it's double counted, and so we have it on the don't forget this list.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Z?
Well, we can only tear down the high school once, I guess. So along with this, I'm challenging this, all of us actually, but in particular the people that are going to have to write the substantive language and the RFP, RFQP, RFCP. Things like, in terms of urban development, urban design, we want to achieve a sense of place, so we need to start defining what some of that might look like. And then if you take that thought a little bit further with respect to having the development partner finance, for example, easements up to and including the metro train station, and how that would work using tax increment financing to do that. And so even if we're not specifically asking for that piece in real time, that we would want to know the experiences of people doing that kind of activity that allows them to step outside these 10 acres. So I want to implement that thought. I think that there's a way to ask them to acquire and improve on easements and other kinds of parcels that would be to the benefit. The other thing is that there are other strategies that would also benefit any kind of high-tech user. So a research facility or a global network complex command center, a hospital. Some homeland security stuff would require the use of critical power. And in discussions, we're made to understand that having distributed energy generation can shave 20% off the CapEx. And so that would be a very powerful incentive to go into this effort, knowing that that could be a possibility. It would also, I think, in my mind, attract the right kind of commercial entities. I look forward to having these and other kinds of discussions as we write what the entitlements and expectations are. And finally, there is one very simple thing, which I think Mr. Goldstein can take on quite capably. It has to do with the transit-oriented developments that Prince George's County is planning already, and some of the things they're talking about with respect to hospitals and major office building developments sound very much like what we're planning. And I don't want all that to happen in 2021, obviously. So if you get more intel on this and give us a briefing at some, what was the word you used, later date, sooner date, right? That would be great. That would inform our thinking on perhaps what we might be able to ask the development community to provide.
So a bit of a comparative study and qualification of other similar efforts in PG and other counties?
I think it's out there. I think, just someone has to call somebody up in PG County.
Okay.
They've got, Metro has identified, working with PG County, 5 nodes on the orange line that they want to develop out.
Well, with Metro's track record of issuing RFPs for real estate development,
We understand that.
hopefully ours will get done much quicker.
Thank you.
Mr. Duncan?
I just wanted to say one thing, and that is, this, seems like to people who are on the outside, not those around the table here, but most people following this from the outside, this is a very complex and fast-paced process, which I think is, just the way it is. Because of that, any one particular week when a snapshot is taken of where we are and what we're doing, things may look good or they may look not so good. And that's just kind of a reality of how this thing is going to play out, I think. The thing that you said that stuck most in my mind is that if something goes south, I think you were talking about the economy, but let's just say more broadly, if something doesn't go as we plan,
Right.
we're gonna have to come to the table and develop a program that makes sense for the site.
Right.
I'm gonna put that sentence up on my bulletin board, and remember that every week when I pick up the newspaper and whatever I read. I'm going to conclude that, we can't know everything, but we are serious people here with, considerable qualifications at the table on this side and on the staff side too. And we understand that things are going to happen that might not be exactly what we had hoped, but we are the kind of people who are anticipating that, and we're going to have the flexibility and the smarts to react intelligently and appropriately to that. Mm-hmm. So the communication strategy for this project is going to be, I think, as difficult as the work that is being done here is, maybe the most difficult thing, to try to sustain the confidence of the public that in spite of a setback here or there or news that we hadn't figured on happening, this is going to turn out okay.
Right.
Because, this is not your first rodeo. And obviously you can tell by the depth of the questioning at the table, excluding mine, because this is not my area of expertise, but, these are very good questions that are being asked by people who have serious subject area expertise. And I just wanted to put that out there tonight because that's something that I hope that the community will work with us on and have some degree of faith that we are going to make this come through, even if on one particular day or in one particular news cycle,
Right.
Something comes up that we hadn't anticipated.
Right. I agree completely. Certainly the mayor and the new council member know, especially, I don't think I've ever had a deal that closed the way I thought it was going to close. So what we're doing is communicating our overarching goals, our expectations of value and partnership and timing, and we will demand performance. But like you said, sir, we're at the end of the day, nobody can predict what the market's going to be like in 3, 4, 5 years. So if need be, we'll come back to the table with a partner we've carefully selected to make sure that we can renegotiate if we have to, because we've selected the right partner and not, revel in obstinance.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a few questions, comments. Unfortunately, I can't read my notes, but let me give it a try. So one on the RFP, one thing that I think is a bit unique for this site for developers is the fact that as a seller, we're not really looking for the maximum sales price. We're looking at the long-term revenue. And I think most developers probably won't go into this looking with that same mindset. At least the developers I know will say, let's give them as much money up front as they can get. Whereas for us, we're looking at long-term tax revenue, and revenue stream is equally important. So I'm wondering if the RFP could maybe even have like just some kind of statement up front that let developers who are looking at this realize that, long-term tax, I know you mentioned it briefly in here, but long-term tax revenue is critical to the analysis of this proposal or something like that to make it kind of crystal clear that that is really a major component. I think it's going to be counterintuitive to most developers who.
I think we'll tell them in the RFDP that we're going to evaluate not only the net present value of the future tax revenues, but also the upfront payment. So it's very much going to be a financial component of the RFDP. We will let them know that.
Yeah, I just think it's important because they're not going to, I think most of them will not intuitively think that. They will think, give us the most money on day one as the purchase price.
We'll tell them no townhouses.
Yeah, okay. Two, you mentioned a 99-year ground lease. I think in the past we've discussed maybe a shorter term, like maybe 60 years or somewhere in thereabouts. Do you have thoughts on whether we can get by on a shorter ground lease than 99 years?
I was negotiating this point with a developer yesterday, and I think, from a financeability perspective, from a net present value perspective, there's virtually no difference between 60 and 99 years. We all know that. It's this developer hang-up that they want it for 99 years. I certainly think in the RFDP process, we tell them that a shorter lease period may be viewed favorably. We might put it into a structure as one of the, but it's a big site. We're talking several $100 million. I'm not sure how much we want to emphasize the desire for a shorter lease period, but we can certainly mention that we'll entertain offers of shorter term lease periods. The 99-year ground lease is pretty much market accepted. It's as good as fee. So when you start talking about 60, and then people start talking, thinking in their heads the number of times they can, revert and how liquid it's going to become in year 30, they start getting antsy. So do the capital markets. But you know what? That's actually something we can investigate in the marketing period.
Well, the only reason I say that, the city's got a long life, hopefully. Secondly, the school has got a restrictive covenant on it, but I think it's only for another 45 years.
Right.
And so there could be redevelopment possibilities for the city, frankly, in 60 years, you can have a whole new situation there. So anyway, I think it gives the city maximum flexibility.
The other thing we've done in the past is we've created a buyout schedule where we've, you know what, I'm going to stop talking.
Got it. Anyway, just plant that seed that we discussed that earlier, and just did you have something you wanted to?
On that point, could I just jump in? I vaguely recall we discussed this maybe 3 or 6 months ago where we had an issue where Virginia did not allow leases longer than X number of years. Did we work that out? And if not, will we?
We will find a way to do it. There is a limitation for cities, but there's ways to get around it using the EDA or something like that as a holding mechanism.
Okay. So a couple more questions for you, if you'll indulge me. One, we talked about the possibility of a taxing district of some kind. I guess what I would like to know is what kind of tax revenue are we talking about? In other words, what is the potential income stream for the city? What impact, if any, that would have on a developer? In other words, I'm going to discount the value I'm going to give to you because I'm going to have to sort of, load back some of it back to you. So I don't know whether there is any. If the answer is zero, the answer is zero.
Well,
but I don't.
Yeah, there's only so far the market can go up, right, in terms of rents, be it for commercial space or retail space or multifamily. So at some point, increasing the cost will decrease the value conveyance to the city. Whether or not we hit that ceiling in terms of market revenue, it remains to be seen, but it should be a relatively simplistic exercise, and eager to engage in it.
Well, it seems to me, the developer is going to always want the maximum rent, right? The question is how much are they going to give away in terms of the total cost to the tenant,
Right.
Right? And so if they got to give away 10 cents of it or whatever it might be, presumably they're going to discount the value they're going to pay the city, I would presume, but you might know better than I do.
In order to maintain the same value proposition for the city, yes, there would have to be some tit for tat in terms of, increasing expenses and, the market rent.
Anyway, I just think we should just go into this with our eyes open. I think it's an important analysis to do, but I would like to know if there is any impact on value, and then maybe the city attorney as well, as what these revenue streams would have to be used for. Like what lawfully, if you do an X, Y, and Z, you have to do it for this purpose. And so I think those are at least the three components that I would like to have a little more information about in consideration of the tax district idea that Mr. Lichtenhouse has particularly raised. But I think it's a great discussion to have. Also, you'd mentioned in the RFP, the evaluation, it seemed like it was really drawn towards qualifications, primarily qualifications. How about the concept idea? I mean, I think that's really important. How do you make sure that doesn't sort of get lost in the shuffle?
What I'm most concerned with, and what our team is most concerned with, and when we discuss with the city managers, we don't want concepts which, in truth, anybody can come up with thoughts about how the site should be programmed and developed. We don't want them to overtake, at least in the RFP process, the clear distilled vision of who is the most qualified to partner with us on this development. So while we won't ask specifically for visual concepts or programs or empirical numbers, we'll look at them, but we want to make sure that they understand they're being judged purely on the things we've talked about before. I don't want a picture swaying, It's one of my reasons for being nervous about having pictures in the public too, is because people can get attached to a plan that isn't necessarily the best proposal for the city. So it's my, and obviously we're still working this document. It's my vision that we won't necessarily ask for conceptual proposals. We can ask for a high-level philosophy on how to program and develop the site, but I don't see full-blown concept drawings and programs as being useful at this point.
But do you feel that if you don't seek some of that, that you're going to get someone who wants to move in a different direction? In other words, I'm eminently qualified, but this is what I want to build. But what you want me to build, and so there's kind of where
Well, we're going to communicate very clearly what our desired, baseline program is. We want 1 million X square feet. We want a minimum of 30-40% commercial uses. We're very bullish on a hotel, a full-service hotel. Or a lifestyle hotel, whatever makes sense. I mean, we will tell them what our expectations are. So then it really just becomes an issue of the visual impact and the planning impact of specific programs. I feel confident that we can convey the city's primary planning objectives and economic objectives and identify 4 to 6 respondents that will give us quality proposals. And one of them will be a combination of the best value and the best thinking in terms of how to develop the site.
And when do you anticipate conveying those detailed, desires or wants? What document would those go out in?
I think the basic program will be included in the RFP. We want people to know exactly what our expectations are.
Okay. A few more questions for you. So when do you anticipate also, for example, somebody's going to underwrite this, and they're going to have full information when they underwrite, whether they want to go forward, what value they ascribe, or whether it's just even something they want to do. So that would sort of beg things like answers to what kind of concessions do you want? What's your standard package of proffers? What is it you anticipate? When do we need to know that? When do we need to let you know that or the marketplace know that?
Prior to issuance of the RFDP.
The one in...
The one in May.
Okay.
I believe that would be appropriate. Wyatt can add his thoughts, but we need to have that pretty well fleshed out in terms of proffer expectations, in terms of special taxing districts, if that's something we want to. So, yeah, a couple months.
Okay.
We'll have to finalize that.
Okay. Let's see what else I've got. Not too much more. Let me, with respect to when you get down to 1, how do you keep the pressure on to get kind of the maximum value for the city? Once you've narrowed it down to that 1 you picked, how do you keep the pressure on so that you don't, there's no competition anymore? How do you keep the pressure on that developer to get the maximum price?
We make sure they know number 2 is waiting in the wings to strike a deal, first of all. We'll always hold all the proposals, and there'll be a minimum time period where we feel comfortable that if we, for whatever reason, can't execute the deal, we go to number 2, and so they will know that there are people waiting in the wings to take their position. The other thing too is predictiveness, clarity of communications. We have a form, exclusive rights agreement that will essentially, codify the, selection, and there will be elements of that ERA that are designed to force performance. And we'll have a clear expectation of, listen, we need to execute this deal in 5 months, right? And that's it. And if we, honestly, I don't anticipate it because I think we'll make the right selection, but if we encounter any resistance, we go to number 2. That's the biggest way to enforce performance, in my book.
That's all I've got right now. Yes, Vice Mayor Connolly, and okay.
Just a quick question about the marketing piece. We've talked about that marketing piece a few times. When do we expect to be able to review that?
Actually, we're working on it now, and I think we'll probably have something to the city manager by the end of the week or the beginning of next week. We're actually coordinating with our in-house marketing team to put together a high quality sort of, it's not a pamphlet so much as it's a very detailed and glossy deck about the opportunity. So my anticipation is we can get that draft to the city manager within a week.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, just one request on the subject of proffers, because this site is so unique and is very different than discussions over proffers and other sites around the city. Can you guys provide an analysis? I think it'd be very instructive for all of us, comparing proffers that may have been secured in other jurisdictions for projects of this size. So when we go into it, we understand the lay of the land and exactly how far we can push it.
Certainly.
Great, thanks.
Okay, anything else anyone has? Did you have more presentation, or is that it?
I know that Jim and the city manager may, but I think my piece is done. I thank you for your indulgence, and I apologize for germing up the room.
Okay. Thank you very much. This has been very helpful. I look forward to working with you going forward.
And I would suggest we let Ted leave, and thank you for your service tonight.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Hope you feel better.
fluids.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a good night, and I'll see you soon.
Okay.
Wyatt, we'll,
That's
Yeah, we don't want that one.
I was
Yeah,
trying to stay far away from
I think it's sick. The mic's sick now.
Wyatt, we'll talk tomorrow or the
Yes.
next day. Carol, thanks for the ride.
Yeah.
So Mr. Snyder and Mrs. Bell. And while they're walking forward, I just want to thank the city attorney, who's been really key in the RFQ drafting process. We have outside legal counsel who is helping us as well, Mr. Jeff Mitchell, and so they're key parts of our team. So next is a discussion of the entitlement process, and so Mr. Snyder and Susan Bell, who has helped us on a number of things, like updating our commercial parking regs and other important matters for the city, has helped us put together a proposal, a draft language of zoning for the site. And if you look in your staff report at line 6, that paragraph kind of sums up what the approach is. And I'll just state it briefly and then turn it directly over to Jim and to Susan. But what we are proposing is that the property be zoned B2, the whole site, 34 acres. Schools are a by right use in that zone. It sends a very strong signal to the market in terms of what our intents are. And it's also very important in terms of some of the other regulatory hoops that we need to jump through, notably with VDOT, where they do a transportation analysis with an upzoning. And so B2 is our most dense zoning in the city and will allow us to go through that in the appropriate way. We would have it be a modified B2 that would allow for additional density and building height on this site only by special exception, higher than in other areas of the city. And the other difference is that it would have a 2-step approval and for special exceptions on this campus. So there would first be a kind of a high-level approval where the council would approve step 1 at the same time that you execute your lease agreement and your development agreement. That would be, deadline of June 2019. That then sets a new zoning for the site. It's no longer B2, now it's this special exception that you've just approved in step 1, and then have an additional approval where you get at the detailed level. So that's what we've laid out in broad brush, and I'll turn it over to our team here to describe that and then have discussion and answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Manager, members of council. As you know, we are in process of replanning the site. And so that's going to be coming before you, I believe, on the 22nd of this month for the comprehensive plan change. And as part of that work, which has already been approved by the Planning Commission, it does talk about the future of this, so that land use plan designation and the text amendment sets the stage for this rezoning to B2 that the manager mentioned. I will just say, I think B2 we're fortunate to have a nice, simple, clear zone that lays out a lot of potential in the city and also gives a lot of security to the council to be able to approve things beyond commercial through special exception and granting of additional height. The purpose of the B2 amendment, which Ms. Bell's been working on along with our city attorney and Carly Aubrey, our principal planner, is to provide some additional flexibility within that category that would accrue to this area of the city, which is will be designated a special revitalization district for education and economic development. And so only in that area, in the mixed-use portion of it, would these special rules apply. Again, with the purpose being to give you the most flexibility and control, so the right combination of flexibility for development and control for the city. And so Susan can go into that in more detail, but that's the concept. And these are concepts that have been used in other places, certainly been used in Arlington, in various places that are high-density sites around Metro. Different names, different categories, but similar ideas. So Susan, with that, do you want to go forward?
Good evening. I'm just going to run through the key elements of the proposed zoning ordinance amendment, but what I want to say first is that what we've tried to structure is an ordinance amendment that is for this site uniquely in the city, but also not one that designs the project for you. The idea is to create a framework that is flexible, both in terms of uses, densities, and heights, so that as you go through your process, you have an ordinance that supports your efforts and your development goals. So as Mr. Shields mentioned, we're talking about a two-step process. And the first step, which would be concurrent with the approval of your development agreement, would be the general plan. And it would be for building massing, building location, infrastructure, your street network, public utilities, the major uses. So it would be the major elements of what would happen over the mixed-use site, and it would provide the framework for the subsequent approval of step 2, the special exception process. So it's actually 2 special exceptions. It means that the general plan would cover the entire commercial or mixed-use site. The special exceptions could be approved for all or a portion of that site. But the idea is to create that framework up front. The goal, of course, is to meet the goals of the Special Revitalization District for Education and Economic Development, and that would be among the standards for approval, as well as the existing standards that are in the zoning ordinance. In terms of density, the way that we have crafted this, it would be 2.5 FAR or higher. I know a range of densities have been discussed. An FAR is not typically used in your ordinance, but that's the kind of development that we're talking about, and that's a low-end threshold of about 1 million square feet, which I think is consistent with what the Alvarez and Marcel study has discussed. In terms of building heights, we're talking about a maximum height of 15 stories, which is about 160 feet plus penthouse. But what it would also encourage is varying heights across the site so that the heights adjacent to the school would be compatible. Because in terms of light and shadows and the fields and so forth, you don't want to have your highest heights necessarily next to the school. The 15 stories is targeted for the best site for commercial development adjacent to the existing arterial roads and adjacent commercial development. In terms of uses, the way this is structured, at the time that you approve the development agreement and the Step 1 plan, what would be in the Step 1 plan would replace any by right entitlement. That the Step 1 approval would then reset what was possible to be built on the site. Up until the approval of that Step 1, the developer would have limited access, with city approval, of course, to uses that are existing in the B2 zone or subsequent to the designation as a special revitalization district to the uses that are approved. Obviously, the goal is to have a mixture of uses: office, hotel, retail, multifamily, with a preference for significant commercial. That is what we would put in the ordinance. And you could, as it's currently drafted, for the addition of significant commercial or more than you have anticipated, you could add additional residential density, for example. So the flexibility is described in there for that. In terms of parking, and largely given the proximity to Metro, we are looking to propose that the standards be reduced even beyond what is currently in the ordinance. So, for example, while you have the ability to do shared parking with Planning Commission approval today, and the parking requirements for retail and office have already been reduced, we're suggesting that with the provision of an exemplary TDM, Transportation Demand Management Plan, that you go even lower than that. You have significant opportunities for shared parking on this site, and we want to be able to facilitate that through the zoning ordinance that's been described. As you may know, I've done work here on commercial parking, and in looking at ratios around the region, I think we could go considerably lower on this site, given that much of this site is within less than half a mile of the metro station. So those are the main elements of the proposal, and it is in the ordinance draft that you have before you, beginning roughly on, I guess it's line 267 is where the text begins. The really substantive changes begin on page 10. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you both for that presentation. Congratulations, Mr. Snyder, on your new role with the city. I think you're going to do a great job. Do we have any questions for either Mr. Snyder, Mr. Z, then Vice Mayor Connolly, then Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, Mayor. Congratulations, Mr. Snyder, on assuming the role of development director. I think this is something that is a particular, what's the right expression, is a particular horse that you're well familiar with riding and getting the most out of. So maybe that's not the right metaphor.
I'll plan to stay on the horse, thank you.
All right, thank you. And this actually looks like a really good set of principles to proceed with. But I know you've probably been working this in the context of, for example, our EDA and others in the city, and I'm just wondering what kinds of issues were surfaced during the drafting of this document and how they were treated.
I think one of the concerns has been making sure we can protect ourselves from things we might imagine that might happen, which probably wouldn't happen, but could happen. So trying to have both the combination of flexibility but more control was one of the thoughts here. Also, we've heard that parking is very expensive, and we know that many people, some places, including TC, have built more parking that later turned out to be excess. So providing the flexibility to build less if less is appropriate is one of the pieces here. And while B2 is a fine zone, it limits you to 115 feet presently with special exception for height. So recognizing we have a site with a lot of topography, with different needs, the ability to have greater heights in some places and a variety of heights across the site made sense. So again, principle of protecting ourselves, giving the council maximum control, but flexibility and providing ability to vary key things like height, density, and parking were some of the watchwords. The mayor mentioned urban design. We've done some urban design work as part of the studies leading up to this work, and so some of those principles are going to be looked at as we evaluate projects in terms of the specific buildings and schemes that come forward to Council and Planning Commission. I'm sure there are others that I haven't covered, but those are the ones that come to mind. Susan, you've been working this for quite a while.
I think those are the major issues that we've talked about.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor Connell?
My question has to do with the parking. I know when Alvarez and Marcel was running all their estimates for the value of the land, the parking was a huge part of that value. So if we are changing the parking requirements, does that also change the value of the land? Is that,
I think we assumed that the parking would be less than our zoning ordinance requires in
Is
our
that already-
discussions with
It
Verizon.
it should make it less expensive for developers, and therefore, there ought to be more value. Parking is expensive to build, particularly structured parking. So if you can build the right amount,
right?
it's better than building too much.
But has that already been factored into the Alvarez and Marcel estimates, a reduced parking requirement?
Do you recall?
My recollection of the study that the roadmap that they
Right.
provided in September is that they were recommending reductions from what is currently in the ordinance. So I would assume that it was taken into account.
Okay. Could we check that to be sure? Because I think
Yeah,
that.
I do recall that discussion. I don't remember what they ultimately used, whether they did a discount or whether they went straight by code. But we'll find out.
They may have looked at the reduced code that we had created. We'd have to double check, but the opportunity to perhaps share some parking with the school to reduce some of that cost, maybe do something creative on that play field that is between the two uses, where we might have joint uses, including parking. I think those things are things that we could explore using an ordinance like this.
Okay, Ms. Hardy?
Great, thank you. So I appreciate kind of the discussion around the balance between flexibility and control and kind of how to signal appropriately to developers what we, want there and what they could get there with the zoning without losing kind of the flexibility and control as well. The concern I've heard most frequently, I think, is around what a developer could put there by right under B2. Does this two-step process mitigate against that risk of someone kind of coming in, we have a transaction? Does that step one of the SE process start right away then? Are they under that new SC and therefore eliminates that risk that they could build something under one of those B2 by right uses that we may not want or be good for the city?
Approval of this step one general development plan eliminates access to anything other than what is approved in that general plan. So they don't have access to all of those by right B2 uses any longer.
So once we sign an agreement with them, the B2 by right uses go away. So we
That's
should
right.
not
Once
have that exposure.
that step one plan is approved and the agreement is signed.
You're essentially legislating that plan
Right.
as the approved development scheme or program for that property.
Could I just ask the city attorney, do you have issue with that at all?
No, we've been working together on this, but I think this is the kind of thing that the developer would have come in with the application for approval of the plan. And to the extent they wanted to have some kind of little interim uses, if the plan didn't go forward right away, they should include it in that plan. So I don't have a problem with that because and what we're doing is, I think, by the timing of the development agreement and having them submit for that plan, then we would protect ourselves against them ever having real control of the land without that phase one general plan in place, which they have designed to be the uses they want to have in conjunction with us under the development agreement.
Yeah, I also understood that there had to be like a by right use. You can always fall back. You don't have to implement, for example, any special exception or any other kind of use that is discretionary approval.
That's right in general, but when they've come in with a plan, the terms of that plan, which they've asked for voluntarily, doesn't have to allow them all the by right uses that
But
are in
any
that
other
district.
any by right uses. In other words, does it
Correct.
preclude any by right? It's essentially, once they come up with a plan,
It would
there's
depend on
absolutely
what the specifics of the plan said. And I think there might be times when, and this is something we would have to consider as we were getting to that, but there might be times when the developer said, well, I would like to be able to do X in the event I can't build my 15-story building right away. But that would be something that would be provided for then in the plan that was approved by council.
Okay, I don't want to belabor the point. I just want to make sure that what you feel is
Yes.
entirely. I mean, to me, I always felt there needed to be a drop back by right under the ordinance if you don't want to implement your
That's
development
right.
plan.
That's-
And I'm not sure. It sounds like you're sort of saying there is no by right after you agree to that. And
Right.
just make
It's-
sure.
Yes, it's more like a conditional zoning kind of thing but we would do it through the special exception, that they would agree to have this as the use that's allowed, that's more, and they would have asked for it.
All right. Anyway, I'll just balls in your court on that. But thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, it's okay. I just had, I guess, 2 follow-up questions related to it. So how does that compare to a proffered rezoning or conditional rezoning, which I think may be more common? And then second is, how does the development community feel about this 2-step process? Have we socialized it to make sure that it doesn't feel laborious for someone that may deter them from going through with it because it's different or new? I'm just kind of curious whether we've started shopping around to get input.
And I don't know the answer to the second question, because my understanding is this is sort of the first discussion of that. And your first question was about whether.
How it compares to proffered rezoning or conditional rezoning?
Yeah, well, it's similar, but we would use our special exception process to do that approval.
So what are the pros and cons of doing it the other way?
I'd have to sit down and think through them all, but I think that the special exception process works well, especially under current law, and gives us a little bit more flexibility with what we want to do. I think given this situation, the plan is to manage it through the special exception process, which is what the city always uses. And then, and it essentially, I think in the end, to a great extent, comes out in the wash and gives us the same result.
Mr. Manager, I think to some extent we get more with our special exception process, voluntary concessions, than some of the proffered rezonings that are happening in other places.
And personally, this is somewhat similar to what everyone on that end of the table knows as the PDSP in Arlington, which sort of allocates density to blocks, and then you come back later and you figure out how do you put the pieces together to make up the total of the block. I do think there's some appeal to developers by just having something really simple. It just says, look, you're going to get this much density. You're going to have to come back in and figure out where to put it, but we're guaranteeing you, or this is part of our deal. This is how much density you're going to get. I think there's some appeal to that than having to try to figure it out. Well, let's say I got this many acres, the FAR is this, but you don't count roads. Oh, you do. And I think if you just have an allocation as a parcel, there's some appeal because it's very simple and straightforward and I think pretty obvious. So I'm comfortable. The mechanics of it, I want to get my arms around a little bit more, but then in general, the concept to me is pretty straightforward and used, at least in a portion of Arlington, with some regularity.
I think actually it should be a little, I think it would be well received in the development community because you would know what you're getting and we'd agree on what you're getting, but you're bound by what you're proposing to get. And, by it really being legislated as part of this first step, in some ways I think it should be very attractive to developers. Plus, from the city's point of view, we would know what we're expecting and know what we should get and have some protections. Certainty would be helpful for developers. Here's what I've got to work with.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you. Could I just make an observation, a suggestion about parking? So I'm pretty sure, we're all pretty sure, I think, that, we're standing on the brink of disruptive technologies that are going to transform the way that vehicles are used and housed in suburbia, even, in suburban communities such as ours, not only Arlington, but further out near-in suburbs. So we don't want to be the, jurisdiction that builds the last structured, overparked development around a metro station. We for sure don't want to do that. And yet, as I understand the schedule that's being mapped out here, we're talking about going to a chosen developer in the middle of 2019, and that's pretty soon. I don't feel like those transformations that I talked about there are going to occur in the next 18 months. Maybe I'm wrong. So therefore, there are going to be people out in a political environment who are going to be facing strong questions from the citizenry about there's enough parking. You've not provided enough parking. There's never enough parking. Now, I know that you all evangelize consistently against that view and generally persuasively, I think, but I think it'd be nice if we could take advantage of the time that we have between now and then to show people examples of the brave new world that we are trying to lead them into. What is happening at other metro stations where development of this scale and nature is being considered? What's happening in Reston? What's happening with, current parking garages? We know at West Falls Church what happens when you have a parking garage which is, surplus, basically. I do think it would be helpful to the community's support, endorsement, and warm feeling about whatever we're going to do up at the West End, if we could educate them more about the parking vision that we see for the future and how that differs from the way that we all operate here now.
That's a good point. One thing I would mention, while we can't, I don't know if we'll know exactly where we're going to be with all those new technologies, but we can look at where we are presently. And Susan Bell led a group in Arlington that evaluated parking standards. Of course, Arlington's been pretty aggressive, and but even so, looking more recently, finding that, gee, we've built more than we needed, and there's a lot of vacant space. And so they went through an exhaustive study and have made changes or recommendations for changes based on proximity to the metro. She has a full presentation on that she could share with us, to the commissions or to the council. And Susan, you can say more about that. But I mean, we've got very, very current, very relevant next door recommendations that a serious group, Arlington County, is saying we need to move forward on this. So I hope we can take advantage of that, recognizing that things may advance even further, as you're talking about with technology. Susan, you want to?
Sure, I think, your small area plan process that you mapped out is the obvious opportunity to take that message into the community, to groups beyond just boards and commissions, civic groups, neighborhood groups, people who live near the metro station, people in the county that live near the metro station. I mean, a lot of these people are going to have questions. And there are answers, or there are responses at least. They may not believe the answers, but there are, credible responses that I think would be helpful to get out into the community. Since we are going to be working on small area plan for a little while, let's make that a big component of that work.
One of my hopes is that she can make a presentation to the Planning Commission. One of the things they're doing, have done this past year, is bring experts in to talk about various topics. And certainly parking is one that they tackled. We've made some good changes to, but there may be more that we can do. And so one of the things we've talked about is making a presentation to them on where people are, our neighbors, on this, and what they've learned from the very detailed study they did. So we can learn at very limited cost to ourselves what we think best practice next door is.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
To the point about parking, there have been a lot of discussions. We talk about NAIOP and ULI, and there have been a ton of presentations over the last year about changing technologies, autonomous vehicles, that type of thing. And I think one of the ways that we can mitigate being the last dinosaur in terms of having a parking garage could potentially be overparked is working through the development plan with whoever is chosen to make sure that they build a garage that can actually be repurposed. And there's a lot of that discussion in various communities where you build the parking garage in a way that the height, as well as the profile and the structure of the building, allow for it to be repurposed. I don't want to say fairly easily because it is an engineering feat, but allow it to be used for potential retail or converted into mixed use. So there's been a lot of discussion on that, and I think that that's one of the areas where we work through that RFP with the developers, signal that we recognize the change and maybe they should incorporate that into their development plan.
Also, smart garages that let you know what's available where, that there is a whole level on the top floor that's vacant, so please keep going. You get better usage of your garages that way, and you don't need as many spaces. So you're seeing that more and more. I think drivers find it very helpful to know where to go, and that's the kind of technology which is here today. It costs some money, but you get better usage out of that car storage space.
I mean, not to state the obvious, but part of how we're going to get parking and all this under control and recognize value for the city is to get a good way to get to the metro station.
Yes.
Right now, we're walking through a parking lot, across structured parking, across a big mess. And so at the end of the day, that's a critical element, and we'll actually see value for that. We can find a nice path or create that kind of path or way to get to the metro.
I did have a conversation Friday with Nina Alpert of Metro, just getting a little update on their submission to Fairfax, which will take a fair amount of time to go through. But she did mention that she would be happy to share with us some ideas, some federal grants that might be available for access to transit. We didn't get specific about that, but we told her that we are working on state grants to improve the site. But certainly if there are federal grants that would help provide connections to Metro, we want to learn about those. So we plan to follow up with them about that.
Mr. Snyder?
Thanks much. The interesting thing is when you follow some of the autonomous vehicle thinking, it may go in exactly the opposite direction. You're going to need a bunch of parking garages with vehicles that are constantly in motion that sit there in this parking garage until they're rented by somebody to go somewhere. So, I mean, this is extremely difficult stuff, but I think having an eye on it and doing our best is, I think, what we're all saying one way or the other. I do want to focus on lines 482 through 487. I like the way it begins, but then when we get to the second sentence, I honestly don't know what it means. And I'm not saying I reject it necessarily, but it would be helpful to understand that we're not undercutting the first sentence by the second sentence. And that the first sentence reads that, you know, we're preference for significant commercial uses, and then we say, well, maybe we don't want that, or maybe we're not going to be willing to put up with, we're not going to push so hard. So I think I know what you're trying to do. Why don't you explain what you're trying to do? It seems to me it leaves a little too much leeway to undercut the first sentence. Now, I'm also realistic enough to probably agree that we're going to need some residential component, but I personally am looking for a very different percentage than we've seen so far. So what are you, tell me a little bit more.
Sure. I think you can imagine.
Well, you know, if it kind of looks good, you know, we'll just ignore the commercial focus.
Right, right. No, the intention was not to do that at all. It really is, it is perhaps a somewhat dated phrase as I think about it now, because it is written in a time when residential versus office is more in market demand, or has been more in market demand. But the idea was, as an incentive for developers, for the provision of significant commercial, we would add the possibility of an additional incentive of more residential, as a way of helping support that commercial development and make it even more viable.
If you could, actually, the way you stated it now, I actually understand that's what you meant, but it's a little clearer than the
Okay,
language here.
we can certainly work on the words there. Sure. No, I appreciate that.
Okay. All right, any other questions or comments? If not, thank you all for the great work you've done to date, and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got, it looks like one last item, Mr. Shields, is that right? Library,
is
does anyone
correct.
want to take a break, or we want to keep rolling? All right,
I think,
here we go.
well, we are very pleased to invite forward our library director, Jenny Carroll, our library board chairman, Brad Gernand, our project manager, Kimberly Callahan, and our public works director, Mike Whitfield. And what council is requested at your meeting next Monday to approve a task order with the architecture firm of BKV to proceed with the architecture and engineering for the library, and the total contract amount is $880,000. So we will go through the details of that with the staff report, and then happy to answer any questions.
Okay, sorry, there we go. As Wyatt mentioned, my name is Kim Callahan, and I'm the project manager with the Department of Public Works for the library renovation and expansion project. We're here tonight to talk about the task order approval for BKV to provide design and construction administration services for the project. In Public Works, we have basic ordering agreements or task order agreements to provide design and engineering services on an as-needed basis. And for our larger projects, we have the two architectural firms, Studio 27 and BKV. Because Studio 27 was busy with the City Hall project, we asked for a proposal from BKV to provide the design services for the library. On November 15th, they provided their initial proposal and also presented to the Library Board of Trustees, where they discussed their qualifications and demonstrated their understanding of the project scope and the goals of the project. And the Library Board voted unanimously to recommend approval of BKV to provide the design services. Now, talking about the goal and the scope of the project, the master plan, which was completed at the end of 2014, proposed a 6,600 square foot renovation either to the east or to the west, as well as renovation of the existing 18,500 square foot library. In talks with the library board, we came to an agreement that they wanted to proceed with the addition to the west side to preserve the limited parking that's available on site. Now, the goals of the project are to bring the facility into ADA compliance, to repair and replace any of the existing infrastructure that needs it within the library, to maintain the capacity of the existing physical collection of the library, so we don't want to reduce the capacity of the library for their books, and then to provide additional public spaces in the way of children's room, meeting rooms, quiet spaces to read, maybe some small group study spaces. Those are really the main objectives of the project. And based on those, the scope of work and the objectives, BKV submitted a proposal for pre-design services all the way through construction administration, project completion, warranty closeout. So from soup to nuts, they gave us their cost proposal, and it came in at $738,000. But we're asking for an authorization of up to $880,000 because we know that there's some additional services that will be needed closer to the end of the project that we don't quite have the exact scope for yet, but we've budgeted for, like testing and inspection services during construction, potentially hazardous material remediation, and then there's also a contingency in there for unforeseen issues that may arise. In the staff report, I've broken out the cost per design phase, and I've also given a description of each of the design phases as well as the public engagement that we're proposing for each of the design stages. If you look through the description of the phases and the public engagement, you'll notice a couple of reoccurring themes as you start with schematic design and move through the design process. One, we're constantly looking at the phasing, the construction phasing of the project. That's an important aspect of the project. We're also looking at costs, making sure we're reconciling our costs with our budget. And we're looking at LEED, making sure we're meeting the city's sustainability goals, and then public engagement. So we want to make sure that at each phase of the process, we're engaging the public and getting their feedback, as well as coming back to City Council for briefings before we move on to the next phase of design. So based on their scope of work, I think based on my experience, the $880,000 upset limit for this task order award is a fair and reasonable fee proposal. Any questions?
All right, anything else, Mr. Shields? Okay, questions? Ms. Hardy?
Offhand, do we know what the cost per square footage for the $8.7 million renovation is compared to the City Hall project?
I haven't compared it to the City Hall project, just the construction costs we were looking at. This doesn't include the soft costs. This is just the direct construction costs. We're looking at $231 a square foot, but I haven't calculated out I could real quick, the,
331.
Okay, for the 8.3. 8.3 million, yeah. The total square footage is 25,100 square feet.
So do we know how that compares to the City Hall project?
For our new construction, that's pretty close. For the renovation, this is lower. And then we have the anomaly of the police and the specialty stuff, so it would be a much more detailed cross-analysis. But for the core new construction piece, it's pretty similar.
Vice Mayor Connolly.
So what you're requesting for this initial phase is about 10% of the total project cost, right? Or is it?
The 880,000, yeah, it's a little over 10% of the project cost.
And is that typical for projects like this, that you do 10%?
For the way I usually look at projects when I'm evaluating them for whether the fee is reasonable, is I look at the fee as it compares to the construction costs, so exclusive of any contingencies. So our construction costs that we're asking the designers and the general contractor to work towards is $5.4 million, and the all-in is about 16% of that construction cost, and I usually see around 15% is my litmus test for if it's a reasonable cost. If you're looking at just their task proposal for the 738 that without the potential extras, you're looking at more like 13% of the fixed construction cost.
And that's in the ballpark of standard. Okay.
And it's less than, the fee is a lot less, is about $200,000 less than the fee that was included in the master plan study for architectural and engineering services.
Okay. And then just a comment on your public engagement.
Yes.
You've got a couple farmers market pop-ups in here, but I would propose that for the library, you really should do story hour pop-ups.
Sure.
Because that's the actual clients of the library.
Well, we want to hit a broad view too, but I can certainly do a story hour pop-ups as well. Yes.
It just seems like the people that actually are in the library would really have some strong opinions.
Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. As I understand it, then the request under this task order award includes basically all the soft costs associated with this project, including negotiating with and acquiring the CMAR and
correct,
and the closeout inspection, the warranty, commissioning, all that stuff, right? So it's
it's soup to nuts. Yes.
As far as we can tell. You have in here a contingency amount of $30,000. What might be some possible reasons to expend that contingency?
Oh gosh, let me think here. There could be, maybe we want to, if the design is drastically changed and we want to, and we need to revise the renderings, we could potentially. I'm just thinking of extra costs that have come up on my other projects. Then we would need to pay them extra if they had already produced those images for us and we were asking for extra. If something maybe comes up at Planning Commission that totally changes the design, that wasn't part of the initial scope, that could potentially be, a redesign that we would need, extra money for.
Well, let me assure you that council will do its best to ensure that the amount of contingency left at the end of the project is at least $38,000. So thank you for that answer. So given this, if we approve this, then when do you think that we would be able to begin construction? What is your thinking on?
Our design schedule is 18 months, so we would be done with design in June of 2019. And we have a conservative construction schedule of 24 months because it's an occupied phased construction. And that's something we can work with the CMAR on and the architect on as we go through the phases of development to kind of bring that make that schedule a little bit tighter. So we're looking at June of 2021 before the library is complete.
So if you finish up in design and basically can award the construction contractor contracts, I would then assume that you'll begin construction sometime in January.
We would begin construction June of 2019.
As soon as,
So if we start design, we have an 18-month construction or design period. So if we start now, 18 months brings us to June of 2019, and then a 24-month construction period brings us to construction completion in June.
So am I to understand that there's not going to be a time gap between the end of the design period and the beginning of construction?
So my 18 months includes negotiating the GMP, getting that through City Council, and starting construction.
Okay. How do you like the noise under your window, Wyatt? Sound of progress.
It's great coming to work every day and seeing things are different.
Good answer.
All right, other questions, comments? Ms. Hardy?
So how does that construction schedule as well as our bonding schedule overlay on our other municipal projects? Refresh my memory on this one.
At a high level, and Ms. Bawa is still in the audience, that timeline aligns with how we had developed the CIP and how we have been doing the bonding schedule. And as she comes up to that, and you can use this mic, just to add to Mr. Z's comment about the design to construction, we've now gone through the process. The council's already approved the CMAR. We've gone through one process of CMAR, practice how to do GMPs, and so we hope there'll be some good lessons learned to make sure there's no gap between the two. Do you want to come over here or just?
Good evening again. We have a little over $1 million in the fiscal year 18 to 22 CIP appropriated for this project, which will be included as part of the bond issuance in May of 2018. And the remaining allocations and appropriations for 19 and 20, based on the schedule, will be presented as part of the CIP that comes in the budget development for fiscal year 19 to 23.
So our bond issuance in, I think it was April or May this year for the first phase of the high school will include $1 million for the library.
That's correct.
Okay.
Other questions? Mr. Snyder?
Okay, so I want to direct this to the library board. There's been some time elapsed since approval, what, a year or so? Is this still the project that we ought to do?
Yes. Although I'm curious as to the background of your question. Could you maybe elaborate?
Well, there was some discussion at some point about, do we do this at relatively high cost, relatively small number of additional square feet, or potentially would we build this into a development? The decision at the time was made to go forward. All I'm with this proposal to renovate on the existing site. If you look at library designs these days, they're all about 2-3-story atriums, large open spaces, which it's hard to imagine we can get with this design. So all I'm doing, because we've reposited a great deal of authority and expertise with you all, I just wanted a revalidation that you continue to believe that this is the direction and the design and the kind of project that we ought to move forward with. That's all I'm doing. It's not a trick question, but there has been some time that's elapsed over the course of this project, over the course of the public debate, and I'm just trying to re-verify that this continues to be the overall course that you want to take, and this is the project that you want to pursue, because we are on the brink of making some irreversible decisions about this, and we're all cognizant of the voters' approval, and we want to carry out the will of the voters, but we also have to do it in a very, way that meets the needs of the library. So that's, I'm asking the board, just for the record again, that this is the direction and the type of project that we ought to do.
I appreciate your question, especially the line of thought. The current design that we're talking about lacks in one detail, and only one detail that we can really see, and that would be typically public libraries have more study space, more public quiet space that can be reserved than than this current design will give us. That's probably about the only thing that we're lacking. And I believe that Jenny would, in the ideal world, she'd probably prefer having a larger public space for the programs, but we're not living in an ideal world. But overall, though, we think that these two, every design will lack something, right? We're actually comfortable that not getting as much of these two things as we might prefer, it's an acceptable trade-off.
Thank you.
Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thanks. Hey, guys. I had the benefit last Friday to tour the city with Mr. Shields and got to meet some of the staff over at the library. Most of the time I'm running in and out with my kids. So it was really good. Sorry, Jenny, sorry we missed you guys.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to cough.
It's all right. I feel like I'm picking it up the last 20 minutes here. I'm starting to cough over here. I'm a little new to this project, not the discussion, but in terms of the design process, my biggest concern walking into this meeting was just the timing associated with this and the other projects that are going on. And one thing that I thought that I would love to request from the city manager's office, if there's a consolidated schedule related to capital projects going on in the city, meaning, you know, we see a construction schedule with kind of the waterfall image that shows the various phases and all the projects that are ongoing. And it's not down to, you know, sewer line repair. I'm not talking about that granular, but, you know, when you talk about City Hall, library, the school, and just understanding the overlap. And the question that I have in terms of the projects that are going on right now, and I asked this question, I guess it was last week, and Mr. Shields had indicated that we're fully prepared for this, but I always get concerned when you talk about this many capital projects going at the same time in a small city. Do we have concerns over logistics, staffing, resources, given the fact that we're talking about delivering the library literally the same month that we deliver the new high school while the City Hall renovation is taking place? So can you help me, I guess, or illustrate kind of the timeline, and then maybe allay some concerns over being able to handle all of this right now? Because it almost seems like it'd be better if we, let's do this, almost get done with it, then start this, then move on to this. But again, I don't know everything that's taken place. So I'd like to better understand that.
Well, it is a good question, and it's something that we have built into the CIP process now, a scheduling out of staff resources and level of effort so that we can deliver what the council has approved. And Mike is working on that, the latest update of that will be part of our CIP development for that you'll get on March 12th. So maybe I'll look to Mr. Whitfield to just, you've taken the freshest look at that question of staff resourcing for a capital program.
Yeah, so what we've done about a year ago, we did some realignment in Public Works, and what this did for us is it took all of the current resources that we have, and we've allocated certain amount of that time towards CIP projects, and then other times we're operational. And so what we've done is we've taken a look at the models. We're looking, right now I'm going through different iterations of the models for CIP, and some of those actually include breakdown of each project, assigned project managers. We're including procurement in that. We're also including other staff time that is normally not included, so that we have a true picture of it. And so right now, the models are telling us that this is very viable. So these projects, they can be staggered. Fiscal year 19, yes, it is our busiest year.
Okay. Who's the project manager on the City Hall?
That would be James Mack.
Sorry?
James Mack.
James.
He wasn't there Friday when you came by.
But just for my own edification, I'd love to have, if there was a schedule, I could see everything in terms of time working on it, not down to the last detail, but just how all those projects fit together.
We can do that because we're updating it as part of the CIP that I'll be presenting to the Planning Commission on February 5th, so we're actively updating it.
And remind us again of what date we can expect that presentation, with a time frame after you present the plan.
I can work with Mr. Shields to plan a time. Council always gets a copy of the CIP at the same time that we give it to the Planning Commission. It formally will be presented to you with Mr. Shields' proposed budget on March 12th, but we can get the schedule and that information to you sooner as just an email, or we can work on a meeting time if you wanted something more robust.
When's the last time we did a CIP update for the City
The
Council?
CIP update was in October, and we're updating the quarterly one now that will be concurrent with the Planning Commission update. So we're updating the snapshot right now.
Yeah. All right. Let me get back with you on an exact schedule. And I know when the CIP goes to the Planning Commission, Cindy's going to be with the Planning Commission pretty much every night that the council's meeting, but we'll work out schedule.
And just quickly, when is City Hall supposed to be finished?
December 31, 2018. We're a 12-month construction, and we have started.
You guys are 19.
June 2021.
delivery, June 2019, construction started.
Correct.
So our goal was City Hall would be done while library is in design, so that when that goes into construction, our big general government project is wrapped. Obviously, the school and the joint campus piece will still be ongoing, plus a lot of other transportation CIP projects.
You've heard me express similar concerns. I'd love a copy of that schedule as well, and maybe the rest of us too.
Yeah, my intent will be to work with Mr. Shields so you all get it as a follow-up to Mr. Lincoln House's request.
Vice Mayor Connolly?
On the same scheduling topic, it seems like the library is going to take longer to build than the high school. And I'm just wondering, time-wise, why is that? Just because of a different process?
As I mentioned, this is it's a conservative construction schedule. I'll give you that.
Right.
But it's also, we have to do this, and if we want to keep the library open while we're constructing it, we have to do it in bits and pieces. So you have to build a piece, you have to pack up things, you have to move them over, then you have to build another piece, and you have to pack up, and it's a four, right now, the way they have it scheduled, it's 4 phases. If we are willing, if we have the stomach to shut the library down for longer periods of time, we could probably condense the phases and condense the construction time. But I think that's something that we need to start working on in the design process when we get the CMAR on board and the architect and get them together to start talking about phasing and what's the most efficient way to phase the project and minimize the shutdown time for the library.
So if we were, as you said, if we had the stomach to close the library,
Right.
which is a huge other discussion, but would that also save money?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
In the process?
Sure. Any way you can consolidate the phasing and save time, you're going to save money.
That is not dissimilar to what we did with City Hall. We started with a 24-month construction schedule, 4 phases, never shutting down City Hall, and we just kept moving. When we brought the CMAR on, it actually became a construction feasibility issue just because we're the mechanics and electrical, and they could save us time and money. By going to a 12-month schedule, it does mean, that's why we're moving everybody out, and council's approved a short-term lease. It comes with its own challenges, but you can expedite the schedule. But you really need to have your architect and your
So that's something that we can take
Contractor.
up once.
Absolutely, yes. That's a huge part of the design, and how we're going to design this and phase that is an extremely important component of the whole design process.
What are the costs?
Yeah.
Generally speaking.
I wouldn't be able to venture a guess at this point. I'd feel more comfortable if we could get our construction managers on board, our general contractors on board. But we know it will save us money. An exact dollar amount, I don't necessarily have that information. I don't know, Mike, if you have any.
I think it would be good to at least contemplate that and then think about options. Anyway, that's something I'd like to know.
Well, the numbers would be quite dated, but this is what you did in the early 90s, right? You closed the library, moved it over to where the CVS is now, and there would be records that would show how much time it took to build the library we have now and how much it cost to rent the the building that's now the CVS for the library.
In my opinion, the best way to proceed would be to get the architects and the general contractor on board, and we can work out the different options and see it from the people who are going to be building it and designing it, and get true numbers from them. And if we do it X way with this many phases, it could cost us this much. If we do it, Y way with this many phases, it could save us, however many dollars. But I think we really need, I don't think it's beneficial for us to guess. Let's get the people who that's their job, that they know it, and they'll be responsible for it. Let's get the numbers from them.
Well, I appreciate you spending that contingency already for that study. I certainly, having done a little bit of construction in my life, I certainly agree with you that it's always cheaper if you're not flying the airplane while you're building it. But let me just say that this would have to be something that the library board and board trustees would weigh in on, and I understand that they're categorically will never consider that And I think that's an understatement.
That has been the case in the past. We could certainly raise the issue with the board again. The idea of the board has been, well, it'd be great if at least a portion of the library could be open and we could at least have limited services, limited programs, something like that. But certainly if there were cost savings involved and if it was the will of the council, we'd certainly talk it over.
A glimmer of light.
The vice mayor dares me, and I just can't not take the dare. So we're going to put temporarily, we're going to put the library in the first floor of the inside building. And that'll give that time to, kind of find the grocery store that the mayor wants. And then the library can move into its new building, and everybody's happy. See, I took your dare.
So I've got I don't know if it's a question or comment, but it seems like in this process, the city council's been less involved than we have in the city hall process. I kind of feel like, have we heard about putting the library expansion on the west side before? I don't recall it personally. Maybe I just missed that. But let me ask about that, putting the expansion on that side. It looks like it kind of bifurcates the use in some ways, like you have sort of two floors of major activity, I imagine, as opposed to now when a lot of it's just sort of spread out in the first floor. In other words, or not on the first floor, but on the top floor, like, all the children's programs, videos, casual library patrons are really all on the top floor. Is this going to change sort of the way it is? You sort of have some of those functions on one level, some of the other functions on the other level?
Sure. I think that the way that the concepts have been running actually would make even more sense. So it would have a floor, which would be the first floor, be the noisier floor, and the lower floor be the quiet floor. It's a little bit that way now, but I think it would become even more so. All of the children's and the teen stuff would be on the first floor. The teen nook right now, that's what we affectionately refer to it as, would become bigger, a bigger area for teens, a programming room, community room that would be even larger than what we have right now. Our conference room, some of you have been in our conference room, is I think about the size of these tables. And so that it would like quadruple. Yeah. I think it would quadruple in size. So our ability to do programming and house story time would increase. I think that the level on the lower floor, the concepts that they've shown us have increased the light that would come into that second floor. So right now, if you've been in our lower floor, it's a little cave-like. So bringing that out to the west side, it would open it up to the north-facing light, so it's a lot of indirect light, and I think would bring more light into that lower level and make it attractive for people to come down into that lower level and use the lower level.
What's the setback from the sidewalk?
Is it 14 or 16?
Well, again, we haven't really even started the full design phase. We're taking the master plan and they're confirming the programming, and they came up with some initial conceptual designs for discussion purposes with the library board. But as far as having an actual finalized design, we haven't come up with that yet because we haven't started the full design process. But the setbacks. I did go to the Planning Commission just to get a general read because we will need variances for this project for setbacks and for impervious area coverage. So I went to the Planning Commission, and what I heard from them is that they didn't really want less than 14 feet setbacks from Park and North Virginia Avenue. So that's what we're working towards as we start the design.
Other questions, comments? Okay. All right, thank you all for sticking around with us. We appreciate it. Appreciate your fine work.
Thank you.
Is there anything else to be talking about tonight, Mr. Shields?
The only thing on schedule, we are really excited. At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we plan to have our groundbreaking for City Hall. Now, the weather forecast is about an inch of snow overnight. but it will be 24 degrees, and I think the wind is supposed to be blowing about 20 miles per hour. So it might feel a more blizzardy. And so I just want to do a quick gut check. We're enthusiastic. We're ready to go. But do you think with that forecast, what we have told the community is if it snows more than an inch, or, like we don't have a delayed opening usually unless there's a whole lot of snow, but that the event will be on unless there's a delayed opening or City Hall is otherwise impacted. Barring that, the event is on. So, Council, do you have any further direction on that issue?
Just if the schools are closed, it might be difficult for some of our council members to get here.
Bring the kids.
Oh, there you go. Bring them out in the snow. If there's a
Come up
2-hour
and
delay
going.
for the schools.
I can't be here either way tomorrow.
That's
so
right. You gotta
I
get
gotta
it.
work there.
And are we still planning on having the meeting at 8:30, the regular standing meeting at 8:30? So we'd meet from 8:30 to maybe 8:55 or something and walk down?
That was the idea.
Okay.
Try to make it convenient.
Okay.
I'm going to go pick my mother-in-law up for the groundbreaking, so I will not be at the mayor's meeting in the morning, but do let me know if you're going to cancel it or postpone it by 8 o'clock. I agreed to make a call to her at 8 o'clock. Otherwise, she's planning to be there.
Well, if you have shovels for the groundbreaking, you can all help take care of the snow.
Yeah, clear the.
It would be good if you are going to do that to make sure somebody's cleaned the sidewalks up around there. It'd be terrible if somebody slipped and, attending the event, particularly somebody who's elderly.
The location for it actually is on the other side of the parking lot. It's in front of City Hall, but it's
In front of the
on the
flag
grassy
poles
side
by
of the parking lot.
the Mary McMahon Library. It'll be right there.
Okay.
Can't miss it. There's a dirt pile there already with HIT bringing 30 shovels for us to heave-ho shovels/snow.
It's like digging in the frozen ground. Yeah.
That's why it was just put to there today and covered.
Yeah, you gotta have somebody turn dirt.
It's not real dirt. It's a fake dirt
Our
pile.
first change order. We need a pile of dirt.
Okay. Anything else, anybody? Vice Mayor Connolly?
I feel like I've asked 100 calendar questions tonight. My next calendar question is, do we have a budget calendar yet for town hall meetings and community engagement?
We have an official calendar that Budget and Finance Committee has blessed, and it does, I don't recall right off the top of my mind, but I believe it's like March 20th, Sunday, March 20th, and then another one in April.
Okay.
So we're keeping with the basic tradition of 2 town halls, but we'd move it to Sunday instead of Saturday by popular demand.
They're both on Sunday afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's the way we've written it out. We can be flexible with. I mean, it's so early days.
Yeah.
We can change it, but
I
that's.
think we like the idea of like
that's
a
what
one
we've laid out.
Sunday and a weeknight maybe, just to have
Yeah, we
a
did.
combination of 2.
Did we talk about a weeknight at all? As a
Weeknight's fine.
And then, so the works, I have to say, I don't remember the Budget and Finance Committee doing this. Did I miss that meeting?
We might have just waved it in front of people and
Right.
said it was done, but
Okay.
yeah.
So could you distribute that to council so we
Sure.
can take a look at that?
Okay.
and Just see, because are work sessions on there too? Do we have a,
The nights of them are, the actual content of them, we still need to finalize. We need to get the school board to get them programmed in. We need to know when we're going to do CIP night and that type of thing. But
Okay.
the nights are reserved.
okay, thank you. And thank you also for the updates on the website about the project, and I'm sure that it will accelerate in the next couple weeks
It will.
as we
That's right. Yeah.
do more
And-
stuff.
That's right.
Oh, my calendar question is when are we standing up the campus committee and the task teams?
So we have put out the request to the boards, the Planning Commission, EDA, the school board. I need to check in on the status of their appointees, but it would be ideal if we can get the names so that you could formally appoint everybody at your next meeting, if that's acceptable to the council. We'd like to get it going.
Okay. Anything else? Vice Mayor Connolly, sorry, I cut you off. I apologize.
Also, today, a message went out to all the boards and commissions to ask for their goals for the coming year, so that can be incorporated into planning for the council retreat. I think Celeste sent that out today. If not, she'd do it first thing tomorrow. Okay. And then the GovOps committee later this month will talk about planning the retreat. it will be at TJ, right? Or, well, I don't know where it'll be. It has been at TJ the last 2 times. Do we know where it'll be? Okay.
All right, what else we got? Anything?
As I mentioned, store manager at the Target, March 6th is their soft opening, March 11th is their grand opening. Okay, she said that they're still interviewing, still hiring some positions.
Mr. Z,
Move to adjourn.
let's do it. All right. Thank you.